Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been carrying this around for 15 years, and I'm finally ready to talk about it. My husband Mike and I bought 16 acres in Montgomery County, Arkansas, back in late 2007. It was our dream property. Rolling hills, a creek running through it, bordering national forest land, perfect for our retirement plans. We weren't ready to build a house yet, so we set up a 30-foot travel trailer there in February of 2008, planning to spend weekends clearing land and eventually building our dream cabin. The property was beautiful but wild. Dense woods covered most of it, with a small clearing where we parked the trailer. We were excited about the wildlife. Deer trails crisscrossed the property, and we could hear all kinds of birds. We set up several bird feeders around the trailer and put out corn at a couple of feeding stations for the deer. I remember how thrilled we were when we caught glimpses of deer at dusk. Mike took photos of everything. We were living our dream. The first strange thing happened about 3 weeks after setting up the trailer. We arrived on a Friday afternoon to find our bird feeders completely destroyed, not just knocked down, but literally torn apart. The heavy-duty wire hangers were bent and twisted. The sweet blocks, those compressed seed cakes, were gone, and the metal cages that held them were crushed. I figured raccoons, maybe, but Mike pointed out that the feeders were hanging pretty high, and the damage seemed excessive even for determined raccoons. We replaced everything but made it more secure. Mike used aircraft cable to hang the feeders and wrap the sweet cages with additional wire. The next weekend, same thing, completely destroyed. That's when I started feeling uneasy. Then we found the first deer carcass. It was about 200 yards from our trailer, down near the creek. At first I thought it was just a natural death, but when Mike examined it closer, we both felt sick. The deer's legs were broken, not just broken, but twisted in unnatural angles. The head was completely torn off, not cut, torn. The internal organs were removed through what looked like a hole ripped in the abdomen. Mike had been hunting his whole life and said he'd never seen anything kill like that. Bears will maul, coyotes will hamstring and eat the soft parts, but this was different. The strangest part was finding corn mush inside what remained of the chest cavity, the same corn we'd been putting out in our feeding stations. When we talked to a local game warden, he just shrugged and said it was probably coyotes, or maybe a bear passing through. But the way he avoided looking directly at us made me think he knew more than he was saying. Over the next month, we found 3 more deer carcasses, all with the same bizarre injuries. It started affecting our sleep. The trailer suddenly felt very small and vulnerable out there in the woods. Our property bordered several other large parcels, and we finally met some neighbors at the small general store about 5 miles from our land. One man, Bill, owned the 200 acres adjacent to ours. When we mentioned the deer, his expression changed completely. He told us his Rottweiler, a 200-pound dog he'd had for protection, had come home missing a leg, not cut off, torn off. The vet couldn't explain it. Another neighbor, an older woman named Janet, who had lived in the area her whole life, told us she'd lost 5 sheep in one night. They were in an enclosure with a 6-foot fence, and something had gotten in, killed all 5, and ripped them apart, were her exact words. That night at the trailer, we heard it for the first time. We were inside watching a movie on our little TV when there was a crashing sound from the woods, maybe 50 yards away, like something big moving through the underbrush with no attempt at being quiet. Mike grabbed his flashlight and shotgun, and I begged him not to go out there. We turned off all the lights and just listened. The crashing stopped, and then we heard the sounds. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was like an ape or monkey, but louder than anything I'd ever heard at a zoo. A series of hoots, and then a long, rising howl that didn't sound like any animal native to Arkansas. Then, another one answered from the other direction. There were at least two of them, calling back and forth. Mike and I just looked at each other, too terrified to speak. The next morning, we found tracks in an anthill near the creek. Big tracks, at least 18 inches long, with 5 toes. They were pressed deep into the soft dirt, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Mike took photos and measurements. Later that day, we found similar tracks in our vegetable garden, along with all our young tomato plants uprooted. We started hearing the vocalizations almost every night. Sometimes they sounded close, sometimes farther away. We began to notice patterns. They seemed most active around dusk and dawn. Our hummingbird feeder, which held a quart of sugar water and was suspended on a thin wire between trees, would be completely emptied overnight. No spillage, just empty. The wire was too thin for raccoons to traverse. One morning, Mike went to check the deer feeding station and came running back, white as a sheet. He'd found a massive pile of scat, not bear, not human, nothing we could identify. It was full of berries and what looked like fur, and the pile was nearly a foot high. Whatever left it was marking territory. We installed trail cameras, hoping to catch images of whatever was out there. Every time, the cameras would be found the next day, with the memory cards missing or the entire camera destroyed. Not just damaged, but literally torn apart. The metal casing bent and twisted. The worst night was in early March. We'd been hearing the sounds all evening, and they seemed to be getting closer. Around midnight, something hit the side of our trailer hard enough to rock it. Mike grabbed his gun, and I was frozen in terror. Then it happened again, harder this time, from the other side. It was like we were being tested. I heard what sounded like breathing right outside our window. Heavy, rhythmic breathing. The window was covered with a curtain, and I've never been so grateful for that thin piece of fabric. The attacks on the trailer lasted about 20 minutes, with whatever it was moving around us, occasionally hitting the sides or the roof. Then, the vocalizations started again. That same ape-like hooting, but so close it seemed to vibrate through the metal walls. There were definitely multiple creatures out there, calling to each other, surrounding our trailer. I was silently crying, and Mike was aiming his shotgun at the door, which seemed like it could be broken down at any moment. The door handle turned, not like someone was trying to open it, but like something was curiously manipulating it to see how it worked. It turned one way, then the other. I was biting my hand to keep from screaming. Then suddenly, everything went quiet. The breathing outside the window stopped. The movement around the trailer ceased. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, afraid to move or speak. Finally, Mike checked his watch. It was almost 4 in the morning. Whatever had been there was gone, at least for now. When dawn came, we found our campsite destroyed. The picnic table was flipped over and broken into pieces. Our cooler had been smashed. The contents strewn everywhere, and all around the trailer were those same massive footprints, 18 inches long, pressed deep into the mud after the previous day's rain. But the most disturbing thing was what we found on the roof of the trailer. Mike climbed up to check for damage, and there was a deer leg, just the leg torn off at the shoulder, placed in the center of the roof like some kind of offering or warning. We packed up and left that day. I couldn't take it anymore. Mike wanted to stay and figure out what was happening, but I was done. We called a realtor the next week and put the property up for sale, even though we took a huge loss on it. Before we sold it, Mike made one last trip out there to collect the rest of our things. I refused to go. When he came back, he was quieter than I'd ever seen him. He wouldn't talk about what he'd found, just said the trailer had been disturbed again. It wasn't until months later that he told me he'd found a handprint pressed into the metal side of the trailer. A handprint that matched the footprints in size with opposable thumbs. but far larger than any human hand could be. We sold the property to a logging company. They clear-cut most of it within a year. Sometimes I wonder if that's what those creatures were trying to prevent, the destruction of their habitat. Or maybe they were just territorial and wanted us gone. I still have nightmares about those sounds, that breathing outside our window, the knowledge that we were being watched and tested by something intelligent enough to understand how a door handle works, strong enough to break deer legs like twigs, and bold enough to surround our trailer in the dead of night. The locals never seemed surprised by our stories. At the general store, when we mentioned selling, Janet just nodded and said, "Those woods have always been theirs. We just pretend they aren't there. We live in suburban Dallas now. No woods nearby. No wildlife except squirrels and songbirds. And that's exactly how I want it." Story 2. I never thought I'd share this, but it's been almost 18 years, and I still can't shake what happened. I need to get this off my chest, even if some of you think I'm crazy. Back in July 2006, I was one of 3 adult leaders taking a Boy Scout troop camping near Sullivan Lake in northeast Washington. It was supposed to be a standard summer trip, teaching the boys wilderness skills, doing some hiking, earning badges. I'd been a scout leader for 7 years at that point, done dozens of these trips. Nothing ever prepared me for what happened that night. There were 8 boys with us, ranging from 12 to 15 years old. My name's James Miller, and I was there with 2 other adults, Rick and Dave. We'd chosen Sullivan Lake because it was beautiful, but not too remote, perfect for intermediate-level scouts to practice their skills without being too far from civilization. The first day went perfectly. We arrived around 11 in the morning, hiked a few miles to our campsite, and spent the afternoon setting up. The boys were in good spirits, joking around while putting up their tents. We cooked hot dogs and beans over the fire that night, told some mild, scary stories. Nothing too intense. Didn't want to freak the kids out. And everyone was in their tents by 10 o'clock. I remember checking my watch before falling asleep. It was just past 11. The next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by someone frantically shaking my tent. "Mr. Miller, Mr. Miller, there's something outside." It was Thomas Parker, one of the younger scouts. His voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand him. I fumbled for my flashlight and checked my watch. It was 4:17 in the morning. Still dark. When I unzipped my tent, Thomas was standing there in his pajamas, barefoot and trembling. His face was pale, even in the dim light. "Slow down, Thomas. What did you hear?" I tried to keep my voice calm, thinking it was probably just a raccoon or maybe a deer. We'd talked about wildlife during our hike, so the boys knew what to expect. "There's something big walking around the campsite," he whispered. "Really big. I can hear it breathing. It hit my tent." I was about to tell him he was dreaming when I heard it too. Heavy footsteps, much heavier than a person's, moving slowly around the perimeter of our camp. The footfalls had a deliberate quality to them, not like an animal on 4 legs. This was bipedal, but it sounded massive. Then I heard the breathing, deep, steady inhales and exhales that carried clearly through the night air. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not an elk, nothing I could identify. By this point, the other boys were waking up. I could see flashlight beams bouncing around inside their tents, and I heard whispered conversations. Rick and Dave emerged from their tents looking confused and concerned. "What's going on?" Dave whispered, pulling on his jacket. Before I could answer, there was a loud smack against one of the boys' tents, the kind of sound a baseball makes when it hits a wall. The tent shook violently, and I heard screams from inside. Not just scared yells, but genuine terror. "Everyone stay calm," I called out, trying to sound authoritative despite my racing heart. "Rick, get the lantern. Dave, check on the boys in that tent." I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight, one of those big mag lights that could double as a weapon, and moved toward the edge of our campsite. The footsteps had stopped when we started talking, but I could still hear that breathing, now coming from beyond the tree line about 30 feet away. Rick got the propane lantern lit, casting a yellow glow over the campsite. The boys were emerging from their tents now, huddling together in the center of camp. Some were crying, a few had grabbed sticks as if that would help against whatever was out there. That's when we all saw it. At the edge of the lantern's light, partially hidden behind a large pine tree, stood something that turned my blood to ice. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. A bear standing on its hind legs? No. A person in a costume? Impossible. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall. Its body was covered in thick, dark hair that looked almost reddish-brown in the lantern light. What struck me most was its build. The chest was massive, like 2 barrels side by side, and its shoulders were impossibly wide. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, much longer proportionally than a human's. "What the hell is that?" Rick whispered beside me, his voice cracking. The creature shifted its weight, moving slightly out from behind the tree, and I caught a glimpse of its face. It wasn't like a gorilla or an ape. The face was more human-like, but with a pronounced brow ridge and a flattened nose. The skin on its face looked like dark leather, weathered and rough. When my flashlight beam passed over its eyes, they reflected back a dull red, like a deer's eyes, but dimmer. One of the younger boys started sobbing uncontrollably, and I instinctively put my arm around him. We were all frozen in place, watching this thing as it watched us. Then it started moving toward us. Not charging, but walking deliberately, each step heavy enough that I could feel the vibration through my boots. As it approached, it let out a sound I'll never forget, a low, powerful bellow that seemed to come from deep in its chest. The sound echoed through the trees, and I felt it physically, like bass at a concert. "Get behind me," I told the boys, though what protection I could offer against this creature, I had no idea. It stopped about 20 feet from our group. In the full light of the lantern, we could see everything about it clearly now. Its legs were thick as tree trunks, ending in wide, splayed feet that left deep impressions in the soft ground. Its hands, if you could call them that, had what looked like claws, though not sharp like a bear's, more like thick, hardened nails. One of the older scouts, Jason, whispered what we were all thinking. "It's a Sasquatch." The creature's head turned slightly at the sound of Jason's voice, those red reflective eyes fixing directly on him. Jason went silent immediately. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we stood in a tense standoff. The boys were huddled behind me, Rick and Dave. We had our flashlights pointed at the creature, though what good they'd do I couldn't say. I was desperately trying to remember if I'd heard anything about what to do if you encounter a Bigfoot. Play dead? That's for bears. Make noise? That might provoke it, so we just stood there, paralyzed with fear, watching this massive being watching us. The standoff broke when the creature suddenly tilted its head back and let out another one of those bellows. Louder this time, almost like a challenge. The sound reverberated through my chest. A few of the boys covered their ears. After that, to our immense relief, it turned and walked back toward the forest. Its gait was smooth but strange, not quite human, with knees that seemed to bend differently. It moved with purpose, not fear. This wasn't a creature running away scared. This was something that had decided it was done with us. We watched until it disappeared into the darkness between the trees. No one moved for several minutes afterward. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "Mr. Miller, what was that?" I didn't have an answer. I still don't. Not one that makes sense. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the center of camp, flashlights and lanterns burning, taking turns staying awake. No one slept. The boys sat in tight groups, jumping at every sound from the forest. Dave suggested we pack up and leave immediately, but I didn't want to risk moving through the woods in the dark, especially if that thing was still out there. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we began to examine our campsite. What we found confirmed that we hadn't collectively hallucinated. Thomas's tent, the one that had been hit, had a large indentation pressed into the fabric, the distinct shape of a hand, but massive, at least twice the size of my own. Another tent had 3 parallel tears along one side, as if something with claws had dragged its hand across it. But most convincing were the footprints. They circled our entire campsite, massive impressions in the soft earth. They were at least 16 inches long and incredibly wide, with 5 distinct toes. The stride length, the distance between prints, was nearly twice what a tall human's would be. We took photos with the disposable cameras we'd brought for the trip. I measured the prints using a Boy Scout handbook as reference. We even made a quick plaster cast of one footprint using the first aid kit supplies, though it didn't turn out great. By 7:30 that morning, we had packed up everything and were heading back to the trailhead. We'd planned to stay 2 more nights, but there was no way any of us were spending another night there. The boys were exhausted and jumpy, flinching at every snapping twig during our hike out. When we got back to civilization, I didn't know what to do with what we'd experienced. The parents were waiting for us at the church parking lot, confused about our early return. I made up something about bad weather in the forecast. What was I supposed to say? Sorry, a Sasquatch terrorized your children last night. I reported the incident to the park ranger station, describing it vaguely as a large animal encounter. The ranger looked at me strangely when I mentioned the size and walking on 2 legs, but wrote it down anyway. The photos we took didn't turn out well, just blurry shapes in the distance and some indistinct footprints. The plaster cast crumbled in my backpack during the hike out. Without concrete evidence, I knew how this would sound to outsiders. Our scout troop never spoke publicly about what happened. The boys talked among themselves, of course, and a few told their parents the full story. Most adults dismissed it as campfire imagination or a bear misidentified in the dark. But I know what I saw. I've spent time in those woods my whole life. I know what bears look like, even standing on hind legs. This was something else entirely. 18 years later, I still wake up sometimes hearing that deep, powerful bellow echoing through the trees. I still see those eyes reflecting red in my flashlight beam. I still feel the vibration of those footsteps through the ground. I don't lead scout trips anymore. I don't go camping at all, actually. Not since that night at Sullivan Lake, when something impossible walked out of the forest and changed everything I thought I knew about the world. Story 3. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. I'm not one for ghost stories or making up tall tales, but what happened last November in those woods has been eating at me. I need to get this off my chest, even if half of you think I'm crazy or making it up. I'm a lifelong hunter from north-central Oklahoma. Been hunting since I was 12 when my dad first took me out for whitetail. I know the woods, I know animal behavior, and I know what normal looks like out there. What we saw that night wasn't normal. It was the second weekend of rifle season, and I'd invited my 2 best friends, Mark and Dylan, to hunt a 700-acre property my family has access to. We've been hunting together for years, all experienced outdoorsmen. Mark's the analytical one, always has been since college. He works as an engineer now and doesn't believe anything without evidence. Dylan's the fearless one of our group. Former Army, did 2 tours in Afghanistan, and I've literally never seen him scared of anything. We'd spent the whole day in our stands without seeing much, just a couple of young does, nothing worth taking. By sunset, we decided to call it and head back to the truck. We were about 3/4 of a mile from each other, so we texted our plans and started walking back separately. My stand was closest to where we'd parked, so I got there first. It was properly dark by then, maybe around 6:30 or so. I turned off my headlamp once I reached the clearing where my truck was parked to let my eyes adjust to the darkness. That's when I first noticed them. About 200 yards into the tree line, I saw 2 greenish orbs of light floating about 7 or 8 feet off the ground. They weren't super bright, more like a dull glow, but definitely not natural. My first thought was that it might be someone with night vision goggles trespassing, but the color was wrong. Night vision is more of a yellowish green, and these were a deeper emerald color. Plus, they moved in a way that didn't match someone walking. The orbs drifted sideways, almost like they were scanning the area. Then they blinked out completely. A few seconds later, they reappeared about 50 yards to the right. No sound, no other lights, just these two green orbs moving through the trees. I'll admit it, I was spooked. I climbed into my truck and locked the doors, keeping my rifle on my lap. I texted Mark and Dylan, "You guys see anything weird on your walk back?" Mark arrived about 15 minutes later. I was watching the tree line the whole time, but the lights had disappeared. When he got to the truck, he looked unsettled. "Dude, did you see those lights in the trees?" he asked before I could say anything. My stomach dropped. "Green ones?" "Yeah, like weird green balls floating around. I thought maybe it was some kind of drone, but they moved too. I don't know. Organically." We waited for Dylan, both of us scanning the woods. About 10 minutes after Mark arrived, the lights appeared again, this time much further away, maybe 500 yards deep in the forest. They were hovering around a ridge that contained some old Native American burial grounds. The property owner had told me about them when he first showed me the land 5 years ago. I'd never given it much thought before. "There," Mark pointed. "You see that?" "Yeah, I see it," I said, my mouth going dry. "What the hell is that?" The orbs were moving back and forth along the ridge, sometimes separating, sometimes coming together. Then they started to rise up higher, maybe 15 feet off the ground. They hovered there for maybe 30 seconds, then shot straight up and disappeared. Mark and I sat there in stunned silence. He pulled out his phone and started recording, but the lights were gone. "You ever see anything like that before?" he asked, his voice tense. "Never," I replied. But I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy. "But what?" "I've heard things out here before, camping, not hunting. Screams that didn't sound like any animal I know, and there's a section about a half-mile east where I found trees snapped about 8 feet up, not cut, not blown over by wind, snapped." Mark just stared at me. He's not one to buy into Bigfoot stories or supernatural stuff. Neither am I, honestly, but I couldn't explain what I'd seen or heard. We were still discussing possibilities when Dylan emerged from the tree line. Even in the dim light of the truck's interior, I could see something was wrong. Dylan, the guy who'd laugh in the face of danger, was visibly shaking. His face was pale and he was walking fast, almost jogging toward the truck. He yanked open the back door and threw himself inside. "Did you effing see that?" were the first words out of his mouth, his voice higher than normal. Mark and I exchanged glances. "The green lights?" I asked. "Yes, what the hell were they?" Dylan's hands were trembling as he set his rifle down. I'd never seen him like this, not once in the 15 years I'd known him. "We saw them too," Mark said. "First when I was walking back, then again just before you showed up." Dylan took a deep breath. "They were following me." The way he said it sent a chill through me. "What do you mean, following you?" "I was about halfway back when I noticed them behind me, maybe 100 yards back. I thought it was you guys messing with me at first, so I stopped and shined my light. Nothing there. When I turned back around, they were closer, maybe 50 yards away." "Did you hear anything?" Mark asked. Dylan shook his head. "That's what was so weird. Dead silence, no footsteps, no branches breaking, but they kept pace with me the whole way. When I'd speed up, they'd speed up." "Could it have been a reflection of your headlamp?" I suggested, trying to find some rational explanation. "No way," Dylan insisted. "I turned my light off completely at one point. They were still there, and then..." He trailed off, rubbing his face. "And then what?" I prompted. "They split apart, started circling me. I could feel, I don't know how to explain it, like something was watching me, studying me. I've been in combat, had people trying to kill me, and I've never felt fear like that. It was primal." We sat in silence for a moment. I started the truck, suddenly eager to get away from there. "You know what's really freaking me out?" Mark said as we pulled away. We all saw the same thing, independently. This wasn't one person seeing something and suggesting it to the others. He was right. We'd all been separated, had no communication about the lights until after we'd each seen them, and yet we'd all experienced the same phenomenon. As we drove down the dirt road that led out of the property, I decided to tell them about the other strange things I'd experienced there over the years. I'd kept most of it to myself, because it sounded crazy even to me. 3 years ago, I was camping out here alone in May. Middle of the night, I heard what sounded like a woman screaming, but wrong somehow. Too loud, too sustained. No animal I know makes that sound. Cougar, maybe? Mark suggested. That's what I told myself. But we haven't had confirmed cougars in this part of Oklahoma for decades. What about the broken trees you mentioned? Dylan asked, seeming to have regained some of his composure. There's a grove about 2 miles east of where we were hunting. Found it last year. About a dozen trees, all snapped at the same height, around 8 feet up. Not cut with a saw, not beaver activity, just broken. Some of them were 6 inches thick. Storm damage, Mark offered. Trees don't break that way in storms. They uproot or snap at different heights. These were all broken at exactly the same height, all pointing in the same direction. We drove in silence for a while after that. Then Dylan spoke up. The property owner ever mention anything weird happening out there? Not specifically, I said. But he did tell me that part of the land contains old Native American grounds. The ridge where we saw the lights tonight, that's part of it. Of course it is, Mark muttered, but I could tell even his skepticism was shaken. We were about 3 miles from the main road when my truck's headlights caught something that made me slam on the brakes. About 50 yards ahead, crossing the road, was what looked like a massive shadow. It was tall, much taller than a person, and moved with a strange, fluid grace that didn't seem natural. It was there for maybe 2 seconds, then disappeared into the trees. Tell me you both saw that, I said, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Neither of them answered right away. Finally, Dylan said, I saw something. Could have been a bear. We don't have bears around here, I reminded him, and that was too big for a bear anyway. Probably just shadows from the trees, Mark said, but he didn't sound convinced. I started driving again, faster now. None of us spoke until we reached the highway. We're never talking about this again, are we? Mark finally asked as the lights of civilization came into view. Probably not, Dylan agreed. Who'd believe us? But I can't stop thinking about it. I haven't been back to that property since that night. I've made excuses. Too busy with work, weather's not right, other commitments. The truth is, I'm scared. I'm a grown man, a hunter, someone who's spent his whole life in the outdoors, and I'm terrified of what might be in those woods. I keep thinking about those green orbs, how they moved with purpose, how they followed Dylan. I think about the broken trees, the screams I've heard, and that shadow crossing the road. None of it makes sense, and yet it all feels connected somehow. The property owner called last week, asked if I was planning to hunt there this season. I told him probably not. He asked why, and I couldn't give him a straight answer. How do you tell someone that you're afraid of lights in the woods? I've researched similar experiences since then, found some accounts of people seeing unexplained lights in forests across the country. Some associate them with Bigfoot sightings, others with spirits or other paranormal phenomena. I don't know what to believe. I just know what I saw, what we all saw. Sometimes I wonder if we should go back, try to document it if it happens again. But then I remember the absolute terror on Dylan's face. A combat veteran reduced to shaking. And I think maybe some things are better left alone. Whatever was out there that night, it was watching us. I can't shake the feeling that if we go looking for it, we might find more than we bargained for. And I'm not sure I want to know what those green lights really were. Story 4 by Raji. I've spent most of my life hunting these woods behind our ranch. 23 years now. And I thought I knew every inch of this place, every sound, every shadow. But what happened last Tuesday evening changed everything I thought I knew about these woods. I'm still shaking as I type this, and I've barely slept since it happened. My nephew Jake had been begging me to take him bow hunting for months. He's 19, eager to learn, and since my brother passed away 3 years ago, I've tried to step in where I can. We decided on a spot about 2 miles behind the ranch, a good place where deer regularly cross between feeding grounds. I've bagged a few nice bucks there over the years. We headed out around 3 in the afternoon. The weather was perfect. Mid-50s, overcast but not too cold, and barely any wind. Jake was talking non-stop about college and his new girlfriend, and I had to keep reminding him to keep his voice down, but honestly, I didn't mind. It was nice having company out there for a change. We reached our spot around 4 and set up on a slight ridge overlooking a well-used deer trail. I showed Jake how to position himself against the wind, and we settled in to wait. I'd brought a thermos of coffee, and we passed it back and forth as the hours ticked by. No deer yet, but that's hunting. Mostly waiting, little action. As the sun started to set, the woods got quiet in that way they do right before dark. You hunters know what I mean. That transition when the day creatures go silent and the night hasn't fully woken up yet. It was around 7:30, still just light enough to see without a flashlight, when I noticed something moving on the hill about 500 yards above us. At first, I thought it was a bear. We get black bears around here sometimes, though they usually keep their distance. But this was tall, really tall, and completely black against the dimming sky. It seemed to be moving purposefully along the ridgeline, stopping occasionally, as if surveying the area below. "Uncle Dave," Jake whispered beside me, his voice tight. "You see that?" I nodded, not taking my eyes off the figure. "Yeah, probably just a bear." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't move like that. This thing was walking upright the whole time, and something about its proportions was just wrong. That's when I felt it. A sensation I've never experienced before in these woods, like someone had suddenly turned a spotlight on us. We weren't seeing anything anymore. We were being seen. I can't explain it any better than that. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Jake must have felt it too, because he gripped my arm. "Uncle Dave, I think we should go." I'm not usually one to spook easily. Hell, I've been alone in these woods in all conditions. Pitch black nights, thunderstorms, you name it. But something primordial kicked in right then. Some ancient survival instinct that bypassed all rational thought. "Yeah," I said, already gathering our stuff. "Let's head back." We didn't run. That would have been stupid. But we moved quickly, deliberately, keeping our voices low. The shape on the hill had disappeared from view. But that feeling of being watched hadn't let up one bit. If anything, it intensified. We'd made it about 3/4 of a mile back toward the ranch when we heard it. A tremendous crash in the brush, maybe 50 yards behind us, like something massive plowing through the undergrowth. That's when all pretense of calm went out the window. "Run!" I shouted, and we both took off. I'm 47 years old, not exactly in peak condition, but I swear I ran faster that night than I ever have in my life. Jake was ahead of me, his backpack bouncing as he sprinted. The worst part wasn't the running. It was the sound behind us. Something was following. Something big. I could hear branches snapping, leaves rustling, the unmistakable sound of heavy footfalls, and it was gaining on us. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like lead, but pure adrenaline kept me going. We crashed through a small creek, splashing water everywhere. My boot caught on a submerged rock, and I stumbled, nearly going down. Jake glanced back, his face pale in the fading light. "Keep going," I gasped, regaining my balance. Whatever was behind us let out a sound then, not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, that sent ice water through my veins. It was unlike anything I've ever heard, deep and guttural and somehow intelligent. We broke out of the tree line into the back pasture of our ranch, the fence and gate about 100 yards ahead. I could see the lights of the house beyond, impossibly distant. The footsteps behind us had stopped at the tree line, but that feeling of being watched was so intense now, it was almost painful, like a physical pressure between my shoulder blades. We reached the gate, and instead of wasting time opening it, we both vaulted over, something I didn't think my old knees could manage anymore. It was only when we were on the other side that we finally turned around, and there it was, standing just at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by shadow but unmistakably there, was the largest bipedal figure I've ever seen. Even at this distance, maybe 30 yards, I could tell it was huge, 6.5, maybe 7 feet tall, covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. The proportions were all wrong for a human, shoulders impossibly wide, arms hanging longer than they should. But it was the eyes that got me. Even in the growing darkness, I could see them catching what little light remained, 2 reflective orbs fixed directly on us. The moment our eyes met, a sensation like electricity ran from my shoulder blades down my spine, a tingling that spread throughout my entire body. It wasn't pain exactly, more like recognition, like some part of my brain that predated civilization was acknowledging something it had always known existed. For what felt like eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, we stood there in a bizarre standoff. Jake and me on one side of the gate, this creature on the other. I couldn't make out its facial features in the darkness, just its massive silhouette and those eyes. Then, without warning or sound, it turned. It didn't slink away or drop to all fours. It turned and walked away, upright, like a human would walk, back into the tree line. But there was nothing human about those shoulders. So wide, they seemed to brush branches on either side as it disappeared into the darkness. We didn't move for several minutes after it was gone. I don't think either of us could. Finally, Jake broke the silence. What the hell was that? His voice was barely above a whisper. I couldn't answer him, not honestly, because saying it out loud seemed insane, even though we'd both seen it. We made our way back to the house in silence. Neither of us mentioned what we'd seen to my wife or Jake's mom. What would we even say? That we'd been chased through the woods by a 7-foot-tall, hairy creature that walked like a man. They'd think we were crazy or playing a prank. But here's the thing, I wasn't surprised, not really, because for years I've been hearing things in those woods that I couldn't explain. Screams that sound almost human, but not quite. Low moans that carry through the trees on still nights. Wood knocking, rhythmic, deliberate, too consistent to be branches falling naturally. And sometimes in the distance, what sounds like chuckling. 3 years ago, after a heavy rain, I found footprints near that same creek we crossed while running. Huge impressions, 18 inches long at least, with 5 distinct toes. I told myself they were bear tracks, distorted by the mud and rain. I knew better, but I told myself that anyway. And last summer, while checking fence lines on the far side of the property, something threw a rock at me. Not dropped. Threw. It hit a tree about 6 feet to my left, with enough force to leave a mark in the bark. When I looked in the direction it came from, I saw nothing but dense forest. I left immediately and didn't go back to that section for weeks. I've never told anyone these things. Not my wife, not my friends, not even Jake before now. Because saying it out loud makes it real. And if it's real, then everything I thought I knew about these woods, about the world, is wrong. Jake and I haven't talked much about what happened. He stayed over that night, claiming it was too late to drive back to his apartment. But I know it was because he was scared. Hell, I was scared too. Still am. He went home the next morning, and we shared this look that said everything we couldn't put into words. It's been 5 days, and I haven't gone back into those woods. I've made excuses. Too busy with the ranch, bad weather coming, equipment needs fixing. But the truth is, I don't know if I'll ever go back there again, at least not alone. Those woods don't belong to me anymore. Maybe they never did. I keep replaying those 30 seconds of eye contact in my mind. There was intelligence there, awareness. Not animal curiosity, but something else. Something that recognized me as clearly as I recognized it. And sometimes, in the middle of the night when the house is quiet and the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear wood knocking in the distance, like it's trying to send me a message. I don't know what to do with this experience. I don't know how to file it away in my mind as something that actually happened. But I know what I saw. I know what chased us, and I know that the woods behind my ranch will never feel the same again. Story 5. I've hesitated to share this for a long time. It's been 32 years, but I still wake up sweating sometimes, hearing those sounds in my dreams. I'm not looking for anyone to believe me. Hell, my own son doesn't. But I need to get this off my chest. Back in early June of 1991, I took my 7-year-old boy, Jake, on what was supposed to be a fun camping trip in the woods near French Gulch, California. I'd grown up in nearby Summit City and spent a lot of my childhood in those mountains. There was something about that particular area that had always stuck with me, not in a good way, but in that way where you can't stop thinking about something even when it scares you. I'd been out of the army for about 18 months. 20 years of service left me with bad knees, tinnitus, and enough nightmares to last a lifetime. The transition to civilian life wasn't going great. My wife had left 6 months earlier, and I was trying to rebuild some kind of relationship with Jake, who I barely knew after all those deployments. This trip was meant to recreate something from my own childhood. My dad had taken me to these same woods back in '66, when I was about Jake's age. We'd gone to collect pine cones with those big edible nuts. Pine nuts, we called them, but that trip had ended. Strangely. Dad never talked about it afterward, but I remember how fast we left, how he kept checking the rearview mirror all the way home. I told myself it was just my imagination, that whatever had spooked my dad was probably just a bear or something normal. But I'd spent my childhood hearing things in those woods that didn't sound like any animal I knew, feeling watched when nobody was around. The locals had stories, of course. Every small mountain town does. I brushed them off as bullshit, even though I never quite shook that feeling. Anyway, I'd convinced myself that facing these woods again would be good for me. Show myself there was nothing to be afraid of, and I wanted to share something special with Jake. Something that wasn't tainted by divorce papers or my PTSD episodes. We left Redding around 4 in the afternoon. Jake was excited at first, asking a million questions about what kind of animals we might see, if we could build a fire, all that stuff kids ask. I'd packed us some sandwiches, chips, sodas for him, and a few beers for me. The plan was simple: drive up into the mountains, collect some pine cones, and sleep in the truck bed under the stars. I had a camper shell on my old Ford F-150 with a foam mattress in the back where Jake could sleep if it got cold. The drive took longer than I remembered. Those mountain roads twist like snakes, and they hadn't improved them much since I was a kid. It was getting dark by the time we reached the turnoff I was looking for, an unmarked dirt road that cuts through national forest land. My dad had shown me this spot, said it was the best place for the big sugar pines with the good nuts. Jake had fallen asleep by then, curled up against the passenger door with his Ninja Turtles backpack as a pillow. I didn't wake him. The kid needed his rest, and I figured I'd collect some cones while he slept, then surprise him with them in the morning. I drove about 2 miles down that dirt road until I found a small clearing that looked right. It was almost completely dark by then, maybe 8:30 or 9 o'clock. The moon was bright though, nearly full, casting everything in this weird bluish light. I could see the massive sugar pines all around us, their trunks like pillars disappearing up into the darkness. I parked the truck facing into the trees so the headlights would give me some visibility. I left the engine running, the radio on low, some classic rock station that barely came in through all the static. I checked on Jake, who was still sound asleep, then grabbed my flashlight and an old canvas bag for the pine cones. The night was cool but not cold, the kind of perfect mountain evening where you can smell the pine sap and hear every little sound. I remember thinking how peaceful it was compared to the chaos in my head most days. The headlights cut a path about 30 feet into the trees, and I started gathering cones that had fallen around the bases of the biggest pines. I'd been at it maybe 20 minutes, had half a bag full of good cones when I heard it. At first I thought it was just the wind in the trees, or maybe some branches rubbing together. But there was no wind, not even a breeze. It was a weird sound, like someone dragging something heavy through the brush. Then it stopped. I froze. Flashlight pointed toward where I thought the sound had come from, maybe 50 yards to my right, just beyond where the headlights reached. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting it. 20 years in the army teaches you not to announce your position. Nothing answered back, but the silence felt wrong somehow, like the forest was holding its breath. Even the insects had stopped chirping. I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a black bear. Nothing to worry about. I'd grown up in these mountains. I knew the wildlife. I went back to collecting cones, but kept glancing over my shoulder toward that spot. Then I heard it again. Closer this time, not dragging anymore, but I don't know how to describe it except as a heavy exhalation, like someone big letting out a breath they'd been holding too long. The hair on my arms stood up. I swept my flashlight in that direction but saw nothing except trees and underbrush. That's when I heard the first impact, a heavy thud that shook the ground. Then another and another, like something massive taking deliberate steps down the hillside to my right. Whatever it was big, much bigger than a person, and it was moving fast. I dropped the bag of pine cones and started backing toward the truck. The impacts were getting louder, closer together. Whatever it was running now. That's when I smelled it. Even from 30 feet away, the stench hit me like a physical force, like rotting meat and wet dog, and something else I can't even describe. Something that didn't belong in these woods, didn't belong anywhere. I ran, sprinted back to the truck, and yanked the door open, practically diving inside. Jake was still asleep somehow, his face peaceful in the dim dashboard light. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key turned. I threw the truck in reverse just as something crashed through the trees at the edge of the headlights. I only caught a glimpse as I hit the gas, a dark shape, massive, moving on two legs. The headlights swept across it as the truck spun around, and for just a second I saw it clearly in the high beams. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark matted hair, not fur like a bear, hair like a human's, but all over its body. Its arms hung almost to its knees, ending in hands, not paws, hands, with fingers I could clearly see outlined against the light. I slammed the truck into drive and punched the gas. In the rearview mirror, I saw it standing in the middle of the clearing, watching us go. In the red glow of the taillights, I could make out its face. Not quite human, not quite animal. Its eyes reflected the light like a cat's or a deer's. Jake stirred beside me. "Dad, where are we going?" "Change of plans, buddy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Road's not safe at night. We'll come back tomorrow." But I knew we wouldn't. Not ever. The dirt road seemed 100 miles long. Every curve, every bump had me convinced that thing was right behind us. I took the turns too fast, nearly slid off the edge twice. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I kept checking the mirror, expecting to see those reflective eyes getting closer. Jake fell back asleep, thank God. I didn't want him to see me like that. Terrified, sweating through my shirt despite the cool night air. We made it back to the main road, and I didn't slow down. Drove straight to French Gulch, the nearest town, and pulled into the parking lot of a closed gas station. It was almost midnight by then. I sat there for maybe half an hour, engine running, watching the road behind us. Nothing followed. As the adrenaline wore off, I started trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a bear. Bears can stand on their hind legs. Maybe the darkness and my own fear had distorted my perception, but I knew that wasn't true. Bears don't have hands. They don't move like that thing moved. And they don't look at you with intelligence like that thing had looked at me. When dawn broke, I drove us to Reading. Jake woke up confused, asking why we were back so early, where the pine cones were. I told him I'd gotten spooked by a bear in the night. Was it a big bear? He asked, suddenly interested. Yeah, I said, probably just a bear. But I knew better, and I think on some level, Jake knew I was lying. Kids can sense that kind of thing. I've spent the last 32 years trying to understand what I saw that night. I've read every book, every report about similar encounters. I moved us to Arizona a year later, took a job as a caretaker at a ranch near Flagstaff, somewhere with wide open spaces where I could see what was coming. I never go into the woods without a gun now, never at night, and I still find myself checking the tree line at dusk, listening for that sound of heavy footsteps. Jake's 39 now, with kids of his own. He thinks his old man just had a panic attack that night, that my PTSD got triggered by something ordinary. Maybe he's right. Maybe my mind played tricks on me, but I know what I saw in those headlights. I know what I smelled, and sometimes when I'm alone and it's quiet, I swear I can still hear those footsteps coming down the hill toward me. Whatever was in those woods that night, it wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything that's supposed to exist, and the worst part is, I'm pretty sure it's what my dad saw back in '66. Whatever's out there, it's been there a long time. And I think about that sometimes, that it's still there, in those dark woods, watching and waiting for the next person who wanders too far from the main road at night. Story 6. I've been a truck driver for almost 20 years now, and I've seen some weird shit on the roads at night. Deer, bears, drunks stumbling across highways. You name it. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, compares to what happened to me and my buddies near Bernie about 5 years ago. I drive routes all through Northern California, and I know those roads like the back of my hand. That particular night, I was in my pickup rather than my rig, heading north where Highway 299 East meets Highway 89. It was around 11:30 at night, mid-October, and colder than usual. The moon was out, but it was still dark enough that we had our high beams on. My two buddies, Mike and Curtis, were with me. Mike works construction, and Curtis is a logger. We've known each other since high school and go fishing together whenever we can. They were half asleep in the cab beside me, and we'd been quiet for a while. We'd spent the day helping Mike's brother move some furniture and were all beat. I remember I had the radio on low, some classic rock station that kept cutting in and out because of the mountains. The road was empty, which isn't unusual for that time of night in that area. I wasn't even going that fast, maybe 50 or so, because these mountain roads can be tricky at night. Plus, I'd seen a couple deer earlier, so I was being cautious. As we rounded this bend, my headlights swept across the road ahead, and that's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't even process what I was looking at. About 100 yards ahead, this massive, and I mean massive figure was crossing the road, from right to left. "Holy shit!" I shouted, hitting the brakes instinctively. That woke Mike and Curtis up real quick. What's wrong?" Mike jerked forward, grabbing the dashboard. I slowed down but didn't stop completely. "Look at that. Do you see that?" I pointed ahead where my headlights were illuminating this thing. It was right next to one of those 55-mile-per-hour speed limit signs, which is how I could tell just how fucking enormous it was. Its shoulders were literally level with the sign, meaning this thing had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. And it wasn't just tall, it was built like a goddamn linebacker, but bigger. I'd guess it weighed at least 500 pounds, maybe more. "What the fuck is that?" Curtis whispered. None of us could believe what we were seeing. The creature was covered in this reddish-brown hair. Not fur exactly, more like straggly hair that hung down from its arms and legs. The hair wasn't uniform, it was thicker in some places, especially around the shoulders and back. In the headlights, it had this weird reddish tint to it, but what really got me, what I still can't get out of my head 5 years later, was the way it moved. It walked on 2 legs, but not like a person. Its knees stayed bent the whole time, never straightening like yours or mine would when we walk. And its arms, Jesus, its arms were incredibly long, hanging down almost to its knees, and they swung in this deliberate rhythmic way as it moved. Not like a gorilla that might use its arms for balance or to occasionally touch the ground. This thing was fully upright, but had this bizarre, fluid gait that I've never seen in any animal or human. We were all frozen, just watching this thing cross the road. It was moving at a steady pace, not rushing, like it didn't have a care in the world. That's when I noticed headlights coming from the opposite direction. "That car's gonna hit it," Mike said, his voice tense. The oncoming car was moving pretty fast, and for a second I thought we were about to witness a collision. But at the last moment the car swerved sharply. The driver must have finally seen the creature. The car's tires screeched, and it fishtailed a bit before straightening out and speeding away like a bat out of hell. The creature didn't even flinch. It didn't speed up, didn't look at the car, didn't react at all. It just kept that same steady pace until it disappeared into the trees on the left side of the road. By this time, I'd slowed to almost a stop. We were all speechless, just staring at the spot where it had vanished. "Did we just see a fucking Bigfoot?" Curtis finally said, his voice higher than normal. I started driving again, slowly, as we approached the area where it had crossed. I don't know what I was expecting to find. Footprints on the asphalt. But of course, there was nothing. On the left side of the road where it had gone, there was a ravine that led up to a hillside. The area was covered with these massive boulders and rock formations, with stands of pine trees scattered throughout. Perfect hiding place for whatever the hell that thing was. "Should we stop?" Mike asked, but his tone made it clear he didn't really want to. "Fuck no," I replied, pressing the gas pedal a little harder. None of us wanted to get out of the truck, that's for sure. We drove in silence for a while, all of us trying to process what we'd just seen. Then Curtis said, "Remember that thing in the paper a few months back, in the Intermountain News?" He was right. I had read something in the sheriff's log about someone reporting 2 hairy creatures running in front of their vehicle in almost the exact same area. At the time, I'd laughed it off as some drunk campers or teenagers playing a prank. I wasn't laughing anymore. The thing that keeps coming back to me, even now, is the size of this creature. I'm 6'1", 200 pounds, and I felt like a child compared to what we saw. Its shoulders were broad, really broad, and its chest was massive, tapering down to a narrower waist. The proportions were just wrong. Not like a man in a suit, not like any animal I've ever seen. And its face. I only caught a glimpse as it turned slightly toward our headlights. It had this protruding brow ridge that shadowed its eyes, and a flat, wide nose. Its jaw was strong, almost like a gorilla's, but different. More, I don't know how to describe it. More human-like in some ways, but definitely not human. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep right. I kept seeing that thing in my dreams, kept hearing the screech of that other car's tires. Mike, Curtis, and I talked about it constantly for a while, debating whether to report it somewhere. But who would believe us? 3 guys claiming they saw Bigfoot on a dark mountain road. We'd be laughed out of town. About a month after it happened, I drove that same stretch of road during the day. I even pulled over where I thought we'd seen it cross and walked a little way into the trees. The ravine was deeper than it looked from the road, sloping up toward those big boulder formations. The whole area felt, I don't know, different somehow. Quieter than it should have been. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. I didn't stay long. What really gets me is how unconcerned it was. This thing nearly got hit by a car, had our truck's high beams shining right at it, and it just didn't care, like it knew nothing could hurt it. Like it owned those woods and we were just passing through its territory. I've been back on that road many times since then, My job requires it. Every time I scan the trees, half hoping, half dreading that I'll see it again. I never have. But sometimes when I'm driving that stretch at night, I swear I can feel something watching from the trees. Something big. I've read a lot about Bigfoot sightings since then. Some sound like bullshit, but others sound exactly like what we saw. The height, the reddish-brown hair, the way it moved, it all matches up with other reports from Northern California. The weirdest part? I never believed in this stuff before. I was the guy who'd laugh at those Finding Bigfoot shows. Now, I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is what I saw that night was real. It wasn't a bear standing on its hind legs. It wasn't a guy in a costume. It was something else entirely. Mike doesn't like talking about it anymore. Curtis gets drunk sometimes and brings it up, asking me if I'm sure about what we saw. I am. I'm more sure about that than almost anything else in my life. Sometimes I think about that other driver, the one who nearly hit it. I wonder if they've told their story somewhere, if they're also lying awake at night, remembering those few seconds when their headlights illuminated something impossible. I still drive trucks, I still take that route, but I don't drive it the same way anymore. I'm always scanning the tree line now, always watching, and I never ever stop along that stretch of road after dark. That thing is still out there. I feel it in my bones, and sometimes when I'm driving through those mountains with nothing but my headlights cutting through the darkness, I swear I can see movement among the trees, something big, something that walks on two legs but isn't a man. I don't know what we saw that night, but I know it saw us too. Story 7. I still can't explain what happened that day back in 1960. Hell, I've barely told anyone, just my wife, and that was only once. I made her promise never to bring it up again. But I'm getting older now, and someone should know before I'm gone. It was late August, right before our senior year started. Me, Danny Whitaker, and Joe McIntosh decided to head out to this cabin Joe's uncle owned near Huntsville, on the western edge of the piney woods. We were 17, bored, and looking for any excuse to get away from our parents for a day. The cabin was pretty remote. We had to park on this narrow country road and hike about 3/4 of a mile through the woods to reach it. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small 2-bedroom place with a kitchen, living room and bathroom. Joe's uncle used it for hunting in the fall, but hardly ever visited during summer. We got there around noon. The air was thick with humidity, and I remember my t-shirt was already soaked through with sweat by the time we reached the cabin. Joe had the key, and we let ourselves in, immediately cranking up the old box fan we found in the corner. "My uncle keeps some sodas in the fridge," Joe said, as he pulled out 3 bottles of Coca-Cola. We spent the next hour or so just hanging out, playing cards and talking about the upcoming football season. Danny was on the team with me, linebacker to my running back, and we were both hoping for college scholarships. It was around 1:30 when I first got that feeling. You know the one? When you suddenly feel like you're being watched? I tried to shake it off, but I kept glancing toward the windows. "You guys hear that?" Danny asked after a while, putting down his cards. We all went quiet. There was a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere outside, near the kitchen window. "Probably just a raccoon," Joe said, but he didn't sound convinced. The scratching continued, then stopped abruptly. A moment later, we heard what sounded like the refrigerator door opening. "Someone's in the kitchen," I whispered. Joe's eyes widened. "That's impossible. The door's locked and we're the only ones here." The cabin had a weird layout. The kitchen was partly separated from the main living area by a short hallway, so we couldn't see directly into it from where we were sitting. "We should check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. We crept down the short hallway toward the kitchen, Danny in the lead. When we reached the doorway, all 3 of us froze. Standing in front of the open refrigerator was something. It wasn't a person, at least not like any person I'd ever seen. It was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, completely covered in dark, shaggy hair that hung down in matted clumps. The hair was maybe 4 to 6 inches long, all over its body. It was standing there, drinking from a bottle of ketchup like it was the most normal thing in the world. I couldn't see its face clearly, the hair covered most of it, but I caught a glimpse of dark eyes set deep in a face that wasn't quite human. For what felt like forever, we just stood there paralyzed. Then Danny whispered, "The hermit." There had always been stories about some hermit living in these woods. Joe's uncle had mentioned it once, saying that food would sometimes go missing from the cabin, but no one had ever actually seen the guy. We'd laughed it off as just another local legend. The thing's head snapped around at the sound of Danny's voice. It dropped the ketchup bottle, which shattered on the floor, and let out this sound. Not quite a scream, not quite a growl, but something in between. That broke our trance. "Run!" I shouted, and we scattered like startled birds. In my panic, I took a different path than Danny and Joe. I was the fastest runner on our football team, and in that moment, all I could think about was getting back to the car as quickly as possible. I sprinted through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms as I ran. I'd gone maybe 200 yards when I heard it behind me. Something was moving through the woods, following my path, and it was fast, way faster than a person should be able to move through dense forest. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning with each breath. The thing behind me was getting closer. I could hear its heavy breathing, a rhythmic huffing sound that didn't sound human at all. Then the smell hit me. It's hard to describe, but imagine moldy, rotten flesh and skunk spray mixed together, but much worse. The stench was so powerful it made my eyes water, and I nearly threw up right there while running. I remember thinking, this isn't happening, this can't be real. But the crashing footsteps behind me were very real, getting closer with each second. There was a moment, just a split second, when I felt something brush against the back of my shirt. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to just keep running. The trees started to thin out, and I could see the road ahead. Danny and Joe were already there, standing by the car, frantically waving at me. "Start the car!" I screamed, still running full tilt toward them. Joe fumbled with the keys, and I heard the engine roar to life just as I burst out of the tree line. I risked a glance over my shoulder then, but whatever had been chasing me had stopped at the edge of the woods. I caught just a glimpse of a dark shape retreating back into the trees. I dove into the back seat of the car, and Joe hit the gas before I'd even closed the door. We tore down that country road like the devil himself was after us. What the hell was that thing? Danny kept saying over and over. None of us had an answer. We drove all the way back to town in a state of shock, hardly saying a word. We never reported what happened. Who would believe us? And what would we even say? That we saw some hairy monster drinking ketchup? We'd be laughing stocks. The three of us made a pact never to talk about it, not to anyone. And as far as I know, Danny and Joe kept that promise. I only broke it once, telling my wife Sarah about it after we'd been married for 5 years. She believed me, or at least she said she did. But she could see how much it upset me to talk about it, so she never brought it up again. Over the years, I've thought a lot about what happened that day. The more I think about it, the more I wonder if the thing wasn't actually chasing me, but just trying to get away from the cabin. We had surprised it as much as it had surprised us, and something else has always stuck with me. I don't think it was an adult. The way it moved, the sounds it made. It seemed younger somehow. Not a child exactly, but not fully grown either. And it was scared, just like we were. I've read articles about Bigfoot sightings over the years. Some of the descriptions match what I saw that day. But I've never publicly connected my experience to those stories. It's easier to think of it as the hermit, like Danny called it, some wild man living in the woods, than to consider the alternatives. What haunts me most is the feeling I had in those woods. There was intelligence behind those eyes. Whatever was chasing me, it wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. It understood, it knew. Sometimes I wonder if Joe's uncle ever went back to that cabin and found the broken ketchup bottle. If he did, he never mentioned it to Joe. Maybe he just assumed some teenagers had broken in and made a mess. In a way, I guess that's what happened. I've never gone back to those woods, and I never will. The three of us drifted apart after high school. Danny went to college in California. Joe joined the army, and I stayed in Texas, working at my dad's hardware store. We exchanged Christmas cards for a few years, but eventually lost touch completely. I wonder sometimes if they think about that day as much as I do. If they wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, remembering that smell, that awful, unforgettable smell. I'm 67 now, and I've never told anyone else this story. My wife passed away 10 years ago, taking my secret with her, but lately I've been thinking about it more and more, maybe because I'm getting older, or maybe because I saw a documentary about unexplained phenomena that brought it all flooding back. Whatever that thing was, hermit, Bigfoot, or something else entirely, it changed me, made me realize that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist in the shadows of our understanding. I still run sometimes, early in the morning when the streets are empty, and every time my feet hit the pavement, there's a part of me that's still running through those woods, feeling the hot breath of something impossible on the back of my neck, smelling that terrible stench, hearing those inhuman footsteps gaining on me. And I wonder if it's still out there, drinking ketchup from someone else's refrigerator, hiding at the edge of civilization, watching and waiting. Some nights I swear I can smell it outside my window. Story 8. I've never been someone who believes in monsters or supernatural stuff. I mean, I watch horror movies like anyone else, but I've always kept my feet firmly on the ground when it comes to reality, or at least I did, until September 2012. My fiancée Jen and I had been planning this trip to the Oregon coast for months. I'm a semi-professional photographer, nothing fancy, just a website where I sell prints and occasionally get hired for small gigs. I had this idea to capture the coastal forests before the rainy season really kicked in. The fall colors would be starting, and the light that time of year is just perfect. Soft and golden, ideal for the kind of moody forest shots I was after. We chose Brookings because it's less touristy than some of the other coastal towns. We rented this little cabin about 15 minutes from the beach. Nothing special, just a place with a comfortable bed and a small kitchen where we could make our own meals and save some money. The first couple days were exactly what we'd hoped for. We explored some beaches, took some nice sunset shots, ate seafood at this little hole-in-the-wall place that had the best clam chowder I've ever tasted. Everything was going great. Then came that day, September 17th. The date is burned into my memory now. We decided to hike the loop trail from Natural Bridges Viewpoint in Curry County. If you've never been there, it's this gorgeous stretch of coastal forest with massive trees and undergrowth so thick in places you can barely see 10 feet ahead. The trail isn't particularly difficult, maybe 3 miles round trip with some moderate elevation changes. I'd read about it online and saw some pictures that made me think it would be perfect for the kind of shots I wanted. We got a late start that day. Jen had wanted to sleep in, and I didn't mind because the afternoon light would be better for photography anyway. We packed some sandwiches, water bottles, my camera gear, my Canon DSLR with a couple of lenses, and headed out around 2 in the afternoon. The weather was typical for coastal Oregon in September, overcast but not rainy, with temperatures in the mid-60s, comfortable hiking weather. The trail was completely deserted, which didn't surprise us given it was a weekday after the main tourist season. We were enjoying the solitude, stopping every so often when I saw a composition I liked. Moss-covered logs, ferns catching bits of light through the canopy, that sort of thing. Everything was fine until about 5:30, when the sun was getting lower. We'd made it to the furthest point of the loop and were starting to head back. That's when something changed. I can't really explain it any better than that. The forest just felt different suddenly. I remember stopping to take a picture of this massive old-growth spruce tree. Jen had walked a little ahead, and I was adjusting my aperture when this feeling washed over me. It was like when you're home alone and suddenly become convinced someone else is in the house with you. The hairs on my arms stood up. I actually turned around, half expecting to see someone standing there. There was nothing, of course, just trees and undergrowth and the narrow dirt trail winding through it all, but I couldn't shake this sense of being watched. "You okay?" Jen called back to me. I must have had a weird look on my face. "Yeah," I said, putting my camera away. "Let's keep moving." We continued walking, and I tried to rationalize away the feeling. It was getting darker. We were in unfamiliar territory. Of course I felt uneasy. That's normal. But then we heard it. Crack, crack, crack. Sharp breaking sounds like large branches snapping, not the small twigs that break under a squirrel or raccoon's weight, but the substantial crack of wood that can support serious weight. It came from deep in the forest to our right, maybe 50 yards off the trail. We both stopped. "What was that?" Jen whispered. "Probably a deer," I said, though I didn't believe it. The sounds were too deliberate, too rhythmic. 3 distinct cracks, evenly spaced. We picked up our pace a bit. The trail was starting to loop back toward the parking area, but we still had at least a mile to go. The light was fading faster now, and a light mist had begun to form among the trees, giving everything this dreamlike, hazy quality that would have been beautiful in any other circumstance. That's when we noticed the bushes ahead. About 20 yards up the trail, some salal bushes were swaying back and forth. There wasn't any wind. The air was completely still. The movement was localized to just that small area, like something was pushing through them from behind. Then it stopped, and the smell hit us. God, that smell, like roadkill that's been baking in the sun for days, mixed with something musky and animal. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Jen actually gagged and covered her mouth. "What the hell is that?" she said, her voice muffled behind her hand. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot. The trail ahead took a sharp uphill turn, and the undergrowth was so thick we couldn't see what was around the bend. The light rain was getting stronger, and the mist was thickening. The forest that had seemed so beautiful just an hour before now felt oppressive and threatening. "Let's go," I finally managed to say. "Stay close." We started up the hill, moving as quickly as we could without running. The trail was getting slippery with the rain, and the last thing we needed was one of us falling and getting hurt. The smell faded as we climbed, but that feeling of being watched only intensified. We reached the crest of the hill, where the trail leveled out before beginning its final descent to the parking area. I don't know what made me turn around. I didn't hear anything specific, no footstep or breaking twig. It was just this overwhelming certainty that something was right behind us. I stopped and turned. Jen continued a few steps before realizing I wasn't beside her anymore. "Mark, what are you doing?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because there, through a gap in the vegetation about 30 feet back down the trail, I saw it. A head, a massive head covered in reddish-brown hair, positioned about 8 feet off the ground. It was partially obscured by foliage, but I could clearly see a prominent brow ridge and deep-set eyes watching me. There was no visible neck, just this huge head atop what must have been an enormous body hidden by the thick undergrowth. Those eyes. That's what I can't forget. They weren't animal eyes, not really. There was intelligence there, curiosity. It was studying me as intently as I was studying it. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. Then it moved, not toward me, thank God, but sideways, disappearing behind a massive Douglas fir. I caught a glimpse of a shoulder, massive, muscular, covered in the same reddish-brown hair, and then it was gone. Jen was tugging at my sleeve. "Mark, what is it? What do you see?" I didn't tell her. I couldn't risk her wanting to investigate, or even worse, me feeling compelled to go back and get a photograph. Instead, I grabbed her hand and said, "Nothing. I thought I heard something. We need to go. Now." We practically ran the rest of the way back to the parking lot. The rain was coming down harder now, and we were both soaked by the time we reached our rental car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. Only after we were in the car, doors locked, heater blasting, and driving away from that place did I tell Jen what I'd seen. "I think it was a Sasquatch," I said, the words sounding ridiculous even as they left my mouth. To her credit, she didn't laugh. She just looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Are you sure? It couldn't have been a bear standing up." "Bears don't stand 8 feet tall," I said, "and they don't have eyes like that." The rest of our vacation was ruined. We cut it short and drove home the next day. I couldn't sleep that night in the cabin, jumping at every sound outside. The few photos I took that day came out fine. Beautiful forest scenes that give no hint of what was lurking among those trees. I've spent countless hours since then researching Sasquatch sightings, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. I've learned that the Oregon coast has a long history of such encounters. Some local tribes even have names for these creatures and specific areas they consider their territory. I've never gone public with my story until now. I'm a photographer, not a cryptozoologist. I have a reputation to maintain, and I don't want to be known as that Bigfoot guy. But the encounter changed me. I can't look at forests the same way anymore. I still do nature photography, but I never go out alone, and I'm always back at my car well before sunset. Sometimes I wish I'd taken a picture. I had my camera right there, hanging around my neck. But in that moment, getting away seemed more important than documentation. And part of me wonders if that creature let us leave. If it had wanted to harm us, it certainly could have. Instead, it just watched, curious, but not aggressive. I don't know what I saw that day in the forests of southern Oregon. I can't prove anything, but I know what I experienced, and no amount of rational explanation has been able to erase the memory of those intelligent eyes staring back at me through the foliage, belonging to something that shouldn't exist but does. The smell, the deliberate branch breaking, the way it moved with obvious intelligence and purpose. These weren't the actions of a known animal, and I'll never forget how small and vulnerable I felt in that moment, realizing that humans aren't always at the top of the food chain, especially not in the ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest. Story 9. It was November 2011, deer season in Washington. I'd been hunting those woods for almost 2 decades, mainly in the Colville National Forest west of Sullivan Lake. I knew those mountains better than I knew the back of my hand. At least I thought I did. I'd planned this solo trip for months. My buddy Mike was supposed to come along, but his kid got sick last minute, so I decided to go it alone. Wasn't the first time I'd hunted solo, and I figured it wouldn't be the last. I packed my Scope 270 rifle, enough food for 4 days, my tent, sleeping bag, and all the usual gear. The spot I picked was this little clearing about 7 miles in from the nearest Forest Service road. It was next to a creek that always had fresh water, even in late fall. Perfect spot, secluded, quiet, and I'd had good luck with deer there in previous seasons. The hike in was uneventful. I set up camp, got a small fire going, heated up some beans and coffee, then turned in early. I wanted to be on the game trail before first light. I remember waking up excited. The temperature had dropped overnight, and there was a light frost on the ground. Perfect hunting weather. I dressed in layers, grabbed my rifle, some jerky and water, and headed out in the dark. My headlamp bounced off the trees as I made my way toward this saddle I'd hunted before, maybe 2 miles from camp. The plan was simple: get into position before sunrise, wait for the deer to move, and hopefully bag a nice buck. By the time the sun started peeking through the trees, I was settled in a good spot overlooking a well-used game trail. But something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. Then it hit me. The woods were completely silent. No birds chirping, no squirrels rustling around, nothing. In all my years hunting, I'd never experienced that kind of silence. It was unnatural. I waited there for a couple hours, not seeing a single animal. No deer, no elk, not even a damn squirrel. By mid-morning, I decided to change locations. I headed down into this draw that cut through the hillside, thinking maybe the animals were bedded down lower where it was warmer. The draw was cold and dark, filled with thick pines, the kind of place that stays in shadow most of the day. As I made my way down, the silence grew even more oppressive. No wind, no wildlife, just the sound of my boots crunching on the forest floor. And then I felt it. This overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. I've been in the woods enough to know when something's watching me. Usually it's just a deer or maybe a black bear, but this was different. This felt intelligent, deliberate. I stopped and listened, scanning the trees around me. Nothing moved, but the feeling persisted. I convinced myself I was being paranoid and kept moving, but more cautiously now. That's when I heard it. Footsteps behind me. Heavy, measured footsteps, like something big was walking upright. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Then came this growl, low and resonant, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a cougar, not anything I could identify. It seemed to come from about 50 yards behind me. I spun around, rifle ready, but saw nothing except trees and shadows. The footsteps stopped when I turned. I called out, thinking maybe it was another hunter, though deep down I knew better. No response, just that heavy silence again. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, straining to see through the trees. Then I started walking again, faster now, wanting to get to more open ground. The footsteps resumed, keeping pace with me, never rushing, just maintaining that same steady rhythm. Sometimes they'd stop when I stopped, but other times they continued for a few steps. Like whatever was following me didn't care if I knew it was there. This cat and mouse game continued for hours. I'd walk, it would follow. I'd stop, it would sometimes stop, sometimes not. Occasionally I'd hear that deep growl again, or the sound of branches snapping, like it was making sure I knew it was still there. I tried to tell myself it was just a bear, but bears don't stalk people like that. They make noise, they crash through the underbrush. This thing was deliberate, patient. By around 3 in the afternoon, I decided to make a break for my camp. I started jogging along the trail, my pack bouncing uncomfortably against my back, my rifle clutched in my sweaty hands. The footsteps behind me picked up pace too, but never got closer. It was like it was herding me, pushing me in a specific direction without overtaking me. The light was starting to fade. November days are short in the mountains, and I knew I had to get back to camp before dark. I figured I was about a quarter-mile away when I had to stop to catch my breath. I leaned against these boulders, gulping air, trying to quiet my breathing so I could listen for my pursuer. The forest had gone quiet again. No footsteps, no growls. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd outrun it, or it had lost interest. That's when I saw it. Through a gap in the trees, maybe 30 yards away, it just appeared. Standing upright, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, like a deep brown, almost black. Its shoulders were massive, wider than any man I've ever seen, with a head that seemed to sit low between them, like it didn't have much of a neck. Its arms hung long at its sides, reaching past its waist. It was a Sasquatch, I know how that sounds, but there's no other word for what I saw. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then it threw its head back and let out this roar that shook me to my core. Not just loud, but powerful, like it came from deep in its chest. After that, it stepped toward this pine tree, maybe 14 inches in diameter, and slammed its arm against it. The whole tree shook. It wasn't attacking, it was showing me what it could do. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely hold my rifle, but somehow I managed to raise it, not to shoot, just as a defensive reflex. When I did that, the creature stepped back like it understood what the gun was. It looked at me for another moment, then simply turned and walked into the thicker brush. No hurry, no fear, just gone. I stood there for what must have been 5 minutes, unable to move, my heart feeling like it would explode out of my chest. When I finally got my legs working again, I ran flat out back to my camp, tripping and stumbling in the growing darkness. I made it back to the tent just as full dark set in. I didn't bother with a fire. I just crawled inside, zipped it up, and sat with my back against a tree, rifle across my lap, flashlight in hand. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every snapping twig, every rustle of wind had me jumping. A few times I heard heavy footsteps circling the camp, but whatever it was stayed just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. As soon as there was enough light to see, I packed up everything and got the hell out of there. The hike back to my truck was the longest 7 miles of my life. I felt watched the entire way, like it was escorting me out of its territory. But it never showed itself again, never confronted me directly. When I got home, my wife said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I couldn't tell her what happened. Couldn't tell anyone at first. Who would believe me? I've been a rational man all my life. I don't believe in ghosts or monsters or any of that nonsense, but I know what I saw. It's been over a decade now, and I've never gone back to that part of the forest. I still hunt, but never alone, and never in that area. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, hearing that roar in my dreams. The thing that stays with me the most wasn't the fear, though God knows I was terrified. It was the intelligence I saw in those eyes. It knew exactly what it was doing. It was escorting me out of its territory, showing me its strength without actually harming me. I've read stories since then, accounts from other people who've had similar experiences. Some think these creatures are just animals, like undiscovered primates. But what I encountered that day wasn't just an animal. There was something more to it. It understood the rifle. It made decisions. It communicated in its own way. I don't expect anyone to believe me, and honestly, I don't care anymore. I know what I saw, what I experienced. Something intelligent and powerful lives in those woods, something that most people don't believe exists. It let me go that day, but the message was clear. I was the intruder, not it. Those woods belonged to it long before I ever set foot there, and they'll be its long after I'm gone. I still hunt deer every season, but now I stick to the popular areas, places with other hunters around. My buddies give me grief about it, call me a city slicker for avoiding the remote spots. Let them laugh. I'd rather be ridiculed than ever face that creature again. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen. Some fears, once felt, never really leave you. Story 10. I've never told this story to many people because, honestly, who'd believe me? But what happened that day in November '83 still gives me cold sweats when I think about it. I was 16 that year, and deer hunting with my dad was our thing. We'd been going to the same spot in Manistee County since I was old enough to legally hunt. Dad knew those woods like the back of his hand. Every trail, every ridge, every good spot to set up. This particular morning, we arrived about an hour before dawn, like we always did. The air was crisp, that biting Michigan cold that gets into your bones, and the forest was dead silent except for our boots crunching on the frozen ground. We parked the truck on this little dirt access road and geared up. I remember being half asleep still, the breath making these little clouds in the beam of my flashlight. Dad was checking his rifle, that old .30-06 he'd had forever. I had my own by then, not as nice as his, but I was proud of it. "Remember where your blind is?" Dad asked me, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, the oaks stand about 300 yards south," I said, pulling my orange vest over my jacket. "I'll be set up to the right on that ridge overlooking the clearing." He clicked off his flashlight for a second to adjust something. "Radio check at 7, like always." I nodded, though I'm not sure he could see it in the dark. We both turned on our flashlights and headed into the trees. I watched Dad's light bobbing away through the woods to my right as I started south toward my spot. The blind wasn't anything fancy, just a natural depression behind some fallen logs that gave me a good view of a deer trail. I'd gone maybe 100 yards when I heard it. First, there was a sudden crash from the direction Dad had gone, not like somebody tripping, but like something big had been startled. Then I heard Dad cough hard, like he'd gotten a whiff of something awful. I froze, listening. That's when the smell hit me too, like a dog that had rolled in something bad and then died. It was so strong I had to pull my scarf over my nose, but it didn't help much. Then came the noise. Jesus, that noise. Something was moving through the woods from where Dad had been, but not toward me exactly, more like parallel to my position, maybe 50 yards to my right. But it wasn't moving like any animal I'd ever heard in those woods. It was crashing through the underbrush like a freight train, snapping branches that would have taken serious force to break. No deer makes that kind of racket, not even a spooked buck. Not even close. I killed my flashlight instinctively and dropped to a crouch. Whatever it was big, and it was moving fast, much faster than something that size should be able to move through dense woods in the dark. I could track its progress by the noise and the way it seemed to disturb the air as it passed nearby. The smell got stronger, then faded as it moved away. For several minutes, I didn't move a muscle. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure anything within half a mile could hear it. When I couldn't hear the crashing anymore, I fumbled for my radio. "Dad," I whispered. "Dad, you there?" The radio crackled. "I'm here." His voice sounded shaken. "You okay?" "Yeah, what the hell was that?" There was a pause. "Probably just a bear," he said, but I could tell he didn't believe it. "Bears don't move like that," I said. "And that smell. Let's just get to our spots. Sun'll be up soon." I knew my dad well enough to know when he was rattled, and he was definitely rattled. But he was right. We needed to get to our positions before the light came. So I swallowed hard and kept moving toward my blind, straining my ears for any sound that wasn't supposed to be there. I made it to my spot and settled in just as the eastern sky was starting to lighten. I sat there, clutching my rifle, not even thinking about deer anymore. My eyes kept scanning the tree line, looking for, I don't know what, something that shouldn't be there. We didn't see a single deer that day, not one. The woods were eerily quiet, like everything was hiding. When we met up later, Dad didn't want to talk about what happened. He just said, "Sometimes the woods play tricks on you." And that was that. But I noticed he was watching the trees more than usual as we walked back to the truck, and he kept his rifle ready the whole time. I tried to convince myself it was just a bear, like Dad said. But bears don't move that fast through thick brush, and they don't usually run unless they're scared. This thing hadn't sounded scared. It had sounded angry. I might have eventually forgotten about it, chalked it up to imagination or a weird forest experience, except for what happened the following fall. It was small game season, and my buddy Mark and I were hunting grouse in roughly the same area. We'd been out since early morning and had bagged a couple of birds. Around mid-afternoon, we were walking along this old logging road that cuts through the forest when Mark called me over. "Hey, Hunter, check this out," he said, pointing at the ground. There in the soft dirt were footprints, not deer tracks, not bear paws. Footprints. Human-looking footprints, except they were huge, way bigger than my size 12 boots. I put my foot next to one for comparison, and it was a good 4 inches longer and twice as wide. "Someone's playing a joke," Mark said, but he didn't sound convinced. I crouched down to look closer. The prints were deep, like whatever made them was heavy, and they crossed the road heading toward the Little Manistee River, disappearing into the thick brush on the other side. That's when I remembered something I'd heard from old-timers at the bait shop, stories about fly fishermen on the river, seeing large black figures, watching them from the shoreline. The figures would apparently stand and observe for a while, then walk away on 2 legs. People always said they were bears, but bears don't typically stand and watch humans like that, and they certainly don't walk away on 2 legs for any distance. Standing there looking at those tracks, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, just like it had that morning with my dad. I suddenly knew, I just knew, that whatever had crashed past me in the dark that November morning had made these tracks. "Let's get out of here," I said to Mark. I didn't explain why, and thankfully he didn't ask. That night, I finally worked up the courage to ask my dad directly about what he thought had happened that morning in '83. We were sitting on the porch, having a beer. I was old enough by then, or close enough that he didn't mind. The stars were out, and the woods beyond the yard were just a dark wall. "Dad," I said, "that thing in the woods that time, what do you think it really was?" He took a long pull of his beer before answering. "I don't know, son." "But you don't think it was a bear?" He stared out at the darkness for a while. "No," he finally said. "I don't think it was a bear." "What happened on your end before I heard the crashing?" Dad set his beer down. "I was walking to my spot, and I got this feeling like I was being watched. You know that feeling? I turned my light toward this thick stand of pines, and I caught just a glimpse of something big. Then that smell hit me like a truck." "What did you see exactly?" "Just a shape, tall, dark, standing on two legs behind a tree. Then it was gone, crashing through the woods." He picked his beer back up. "Whatever it was, it doesn't much matter now. It's gone." But I wasn't so sure it was gone. The Manistee National Forest is huge, over 1 million acres of dense woodland, rivers and swamps. Perfect hiding place for something that doesn't want to be found. I still hunt those woods, but I'm a lot more careful now. I pay attention to sounds that don't belong, to movements at the edge of my vision. And sometimes, when I'm sitting in my blind in the pre-dawn darkness, I catch that smell again, just a hint of it on the breeze. When that happens, I grip my rifle a little tighter and remind myself that maybe, just maybe, I'm not the only one doing the hunting. I've talked to a few other locals over the years who've had similar experiences. Always brief encounters, always at dawn or dusk, always leaving them questioning what they saw or heard. One old-timer who's fished the Little Manistee for 50 years told me he's seen the big man 3 times, always on the opposite bank, always watching before melting back into the trees. The thing that gets me is how something that big, that loud, can vanish so completely. How can it move through the forest like a ghost one minute and like a bulldozer the next? And why does it sometimes seem to want to be noticed while other times it stays hidden? I don't have answers. I just know what I experienced, what I heard, what I smelled, and I know those tracks were real, much too large to be human, too clearly foot-shaped to be anything else. The Manistee Forest keeps its secrets well. I still go there, still hunt there, but now I always have the feeling that I'm being allowed to be there, that something is watching, assessing, deciding whether I'm a threat, and I always leave before dark. Story 11. I was 34 at the time, had been fishing those Kentucky waters since I was a kid. My dad taught me everything about angling when I was just tall enough to hold a rod, and I'd spent most of my life exploring every creek, river and lake within 100 miles of my home in Lexington. Red River Gorge was one of my favorite spots. Beautiful scenery, good fishing, and usually quiet enough that you could have whole stretches of river to yourself. That day in May was perfect fishing weather, overcast but not rainy, around 65 degrees with a light breeze. I remember thinking it might be my last chance to get out before summer tourists started flooding the area. I'd taken a Friday off work specifically to avoid the weekend crowds. Left home around 4 in the morning, got to my spot just as the sun was coming up. I hiked about 2 miles in from where I'd parked my truck, following a trail I knew well that eventually disappeared into the underbrush. There was this particular bend in the river I loved, a deep pool where I'd caught some monster smallmouth bass in the past. Getting there required scrambling down some rocks, but it was worth it because hardly anybody else made the effort. The fishing was decent that morning. Caught a few bass, nothing spectacular, but I was just happy to be out there. I had my little Coleman stove and made some coffee around noon, ate the sandwich I'd packed. Simple pleasures, you know? The kind of perfect solitude that recharges you after dealing with people and problems all week. As the afternoon wore on, I decided to try a different spot about a quarter-mile upstream. There was a wider, shallower section of river there, only about knee-deep in most places, with some larger rocks creating little rapids. The opposite bank had dense forest coming right up to the water, tall pines and old hardwoods that created deep shadows even in daytime. I was so focused on my fishing that I barely noticed the hours passing. It wasn't until I felt the temperature dropping that I realized dusk was approaching. The light had that golden quality it gets in the evening, and I figured I had maybe another hour before I'd need to pack up and start the hike back. That's when I heard it, the sound of branches breaking across the river. Not small twigs, but the distinct crack of substantial limbs snapping. My first thought was deer, maybe a bear, though bears aren't all that common in that part of Kentucky. I looked up from my line, expecting to see wildlife. What I saw instead froze my blood. Standing at the tree line on the opposite bank, partially obscured by shadows but clearly visible, was something I still struggle to describe. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more, broad shoulders that must have been twice as wide as mine, and I was no small guy back then. It was covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, more like long hair, dark brown or black, hanging over its body. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. I remember thinking it must be a bear standing on its hind legs, but that didn't fit what I was looking at. Its proportions were all wrong for a bear. The arms were too long, hanging down past its waist, and it stood upright in a way that seemed completely natural. I stood there, fishing rod still in my hands, completely unable to move. That's when it stepped forward out of the shadows, and I got a clearer look at its face. The face is what still haunts my dreams sometimes. It had a flat, wide nose and deep-set eyes under a heavy brow ridge. Its mouth was wide, and the skin on its face was darker than the hair, almost a grayish black. Those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. There was something in them, an intelligence that sent chills through me. I finally managed to move, taking a step backward, nearly stumbling over the rocks behind me. That movement seemed to trigger something in the creature. It tilted its head slightly, like it was curious, then did something I never expected. It stepped into the river. The water was only about 3 feet deep at that point, and it crossed with alarming speed, not even slowing down as it waded through the current. Each step it took covered at least twice what a human could manage. I remember the splashing sound, how the water barely seemed to slow it down. That's when panic hit me. I turned to run, only to realize I was in a terrible position. Behind me was a steep rock face, too sheer to climb quickly. To my left was deeper water that I'd have to swim across, and I was weighed down with gear. To my right, the riverbank continued for about 50 yards before rising up into the forest. But that was the direction the creature was approaching from. I was effectively cornered, and it knew it. By the time I'd assessed my limited options, the thing was already on my side of the river, maybe 30 feet away. It stopped then, water still dripping from its lower half. In that moment, I remembered my fishing knife, a pathetic defense against something so massive, but it was all I had. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get it out of its sheath. The creature saw the knife and did something else unexpected. It started circling me, not rushing in, but deliberately moving in an arc that kept cutting off my escape route toward the forest. It was herding me, keeping me trapped between the river and the rocks. The intelligence behind that strategy terrified me more than its size. We did this dance for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. Every time I tried to edge toward an escape route, it would shift its position to block me. All the while, it never took its eyes off me, and I could hear its breathing, heavy but controlled. At one point, it came within 15 feet of me. close enough that I could smell it. A musky, wild smell, like wet fur and soil and something else I couldn't identify. Not rotting or foul like some stories describe, just intensely wild. I remember every detail of those moments with a clarity that's almost painful. The way its chest rose and fell with each breath. How its hands, and they were hands, not paws, hung at its sides with fingers that looked capable of crushing stone. The way it occasionally tilted its head as it studied me, like it was trying to figure me out just as much as I was trying to understand what I was seeing. I was convinced I was going to die. Every instinct was screaming that I was in the presence of an apex predator, something at the very top of the food chain, something that could tear me apart without effort, yet it wasn't attacking, it was evaluating. Just when I thought my legs would give out from sheer terror, something changed. The creature stopped its circling. It stood completely still for a moment, its dark eyes still fixed on me. Then it did something that makes no sense to this day. It backed away. It didn't turn around. It stepped backward, maintaining eye contact until it reached the water's edge. Then it turned, crossed the river with the same alarming speed as before, and disappeared into the forest on the other side. I stood there for at least 10 minutes, knife still in my hand, unable to move, listening for any sound that might indicate it was coming back. Finally, survival instinct kicked in. I gathered my gear with trembling hands, abandoned half of it because I couldn't bear to take the time to pack properly, and got the hell out of there. The hike back to my truck was the most terrifying 2 miles I've ever walked. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me spinning around, expecting to see that massive shape emerging from the trees. I kept the knife in my hand the entire way, though I knew it would be useless if the creature decided to come after me. I drove home in a daze, hands still shaking on the steering wheel. Didn't tell my wife the truth about what happened, just said I'd had a close encounter with a bear and was spooked. I couldn't bring myself to describe what I'd actually seen. Who would believe me? That was 24 years ago, and I've never been back to that spot. Actually, I didn't go fishing alone anywhere for almost 5 years afterward. Even now, I only fish in open areas with good visibility, usually with a companion. What haunts me most isn't just the creature's size or strength, but the intelligence I saw in those eyes. This wasn't a mindless animal. It made decisions, assessed the situation, and for some reason I'll never understand, chose to let me go. The woods I loved my entire life became something different that day, something mysterious and not entirely safe. I still go out there, still fish and occasionally hunt, but I never shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that there are things in those quiet forests that most people will never see and wouldn't believe if you told them. I don't expect anyone to believe this account. Hell, sometimes I wake up and wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember those eyes, that deliberate circling, the sound of its breathing. And I know what I saw was real. Something exists out there in the wilderness that science hasn't classified, that most people will never encounter, and those of us who have seen it are forever changed by the knowledge that we share this world with creatures beyond our understanding. Story 12. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. September 4th, 2010. It's been over a decade, but I remember every detail like it was yesterday. Some things just burn themselves into your memory, you know? My cousin Marcus and I had leased this hunting property in Harrison County, not far from Sia, Ohio. About 80 acres of mixed hardwoods with some swampy areas on the north end, perfect for deer and turkey. We'd had it for 3 seasons by then, and that day we were just doing some maintenance work, clearing 4-wheeler trails before the season officially opened. It was around 9 in the morning, warm for September but not unbearable. We'd been working since sunrise, me with a chainsaw cutting fallen trees that blocked the trails, and Marcus following behind with a machete to clear brush. Normal stuff we'd done a dozen times before. We'd brought our sidearms. Marcus had his, 45, and I had my Glock 9mm, but that was just standard for us when out in the woods. Wasn't expecting to need them for anything more than maybe a copperhead. We were about halfway through our planned route when it happened. It's hard to explain if you've never experienced it, but the woods just went silent. And I don't mean it got quiet. I mean it went completely, utterly silent in a matter of seconds. 1 minute there were birds calling, squirrels chattering, leaves rustling, all the normal background noise you get used to in the forest. Then nothing. Like someone had hit a mute button on the whole damn place. I shut off my chainsaw, thinking maybe the noise had scared everything away, but that didn't explain the total absence of sound. Marcus noticed it too. He stopped what he was doing and looked at me with this confused expression. "You hear that?" he whispered. "I don't hear anything," I said back, keeping my voice low for some reason I couldn't explain. That's the problem. We both just stood there for a minute, straining to hear anything. The silence was so complete it felt physical, like pressure against my eardrums. The hair on my arms stood up, and I had this overwhelming feeling of being watched. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead of us, partially hidden behind a massive oak tree, was something. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it as a bear, but bears don't stand upright for that long. And this thing was tall. Really tall. "Marcus," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. "Look over there, by that big oak. 2 o'clock. Marcus turned slowly, and I heard his sharp intake of breath when he spotted it too. The creature was standing perfectly still, only half visible behind the tree. I could see one side of its face, part of a shoulder and its left arm. It was covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, but hair, deep brown or black, I couldn't tell in the shadows. But what I could tell was that this thing was enormous. I'm 6'1", and this creature had to be at least 8 feet tall. Without even thinking about it, my hand moved to my sidearm. I didn't draw it, just rested my palm on the grip. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Marcus do the same thing. "You seeing what I'm seeing?" I whispered, not taking my eyes off the figure. "If you're seeing a fucking Bigfoot, then yeah," Marcus whispered back. The creature hadn't moved. It was just watching us. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't clearly see its face. The part of its face I could see looked almost human-like, but broader, with a prominent brow ridge. Its arm was massive, muscular and long, hanging lower than a human's would. Time seemed to stretch out forever as we stood there in that standoff. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the thing could hear it. My mouth was bone dry, and I couldn't have shouted if I'd wanted to. Then, without warning, the creature moved. It didn't charge us, thank God. Instead, it turned and started running perpendicular to where we were standing, heading toward the swampy section of the property. And holy shit, the way it moved. I've never seen anything like it. It ran upright, completely on 2 legs like a human, never dropping to all 4s like a bear would. But the power in its movements was unreal. It crashed through the underbrush like it was nothing, pushing aside saplings and small trees that bent and snapped behind it. Trees that would have stopped me dead in my tracks, this thing was just shoving aside like they were made of cardboard. The silence was shattered by the sound of its passage, cracking branches, the whoosh of disturbed vegetation, and this weird huffing sound that might have been its breathing. It moved with incredible speed for something so large, covering ground in these massive strides, and then it was gone, disappeared into the thicker vegetation near the swamp. Marcus and I stood frozen for what felt like 5 minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds. Neither of us had drawn our weapons. What would have been the point? That thing was so big and fast, I'm not sure a 9mm would have done anything but piss it off. "What the fuck?" Marcus finally said, his voice shaking. "What the actual fuck was that?" I couldn't even answer at first. My mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I've been hunting these woods my entire life, grew up in rural Ohio, spent more time in forests than most people spend in shopping malls, and I had never seen anything like that. Never even heard stories about anything like that in our area. Should we follow it Marcus asked, not sounding particularly eager to do so. I found my voice. Are you out of your mind? That thing could tear us apart. But curiosity is a powerful force. After another few minutes of standing there, our breathing starting to return to normal, we cautiously moved forward to where the creature had been standing. The ground was hard and dry from a hot August, so there weren't any clear footprints, but there was a small tuft of dark hair caught on the rough bark of the oak tree. I reached out to touch it, then pulled my hand back. For some reason, I didn't want to touch it. Let's check where it ran through, I suggested, and we followed the path of destruction. It was like following the trail of a bulldozer. Small trees, 3 or 4 inches in diameter, were bent over or snapped. Bushes were flattened. The trail was about 4 feet wide, the width of the creature's body as it had pushed through. We followed it about 100 yards toward the swamp before stopping. We should go back, Marcus said, looking nervously at the dense vegetation ahead. If that thing's still around. I nodded. We turned around and headed back to our 4-wheelers without saying much. My mind was racing, trying to process what we'd seen. A bear? No way. Bears don't move like that. A man in a suit. The movement was too fluid, too powerful. The way it pushed through those trees required strength no human possesses. When we got back to our vehicles, we sat down on a fallen log and finally really talked about it. That was a Bigfoot, Marcus said flatly. Has to be. I'd always been skeptical about Bigfoot stories, thought they were bullshit, honestly, but after what I'd just seen, I couldn't deny it anymore. Yeah, I said, I think it was. What do we do? Marcus asked. Tell people? I thought about it. Who's going to believe us? They'll think we're crazy or attention-seeking or just saw a bear. We know what we saw, Marcus insisted. That wasn't a bear. I know, but I trailed off. I was thinking about our hunting lease. If word got out that there was a Bigfoot on the property, we'd have cryptid hunters and curiosity seekers trespassing all over. Our hunting would be ruined, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted that kind of attention. Let's keep it between us, I finally said, at least for now. Marcus agreed reluctantly. We finished our work that day, but our hearts weren't in it. We kept looking over our shoulders, starting at every sound. The woods had returned to normal, birds singing, squirrels chattering, but it didn't feel normal to us anymore. We hunted that property for the rest of the season, but things were different. We never went in unarmed after that day, not even to check trail cameras. We stayed together whenever possible, and we avoided the swampy area entirely. I never saw the creature again, but there were times when I felt watched. Times when the woods would get unusually quiet, though never with that complete, unnatural silence of that September morning. Once, we found a tree that had been snapped about 7 feet up. Not fallen or broken by wind, but actually snapped sideways like something massive had pushed against it. The following spring, we decided not to renew the lease. Neither of us said it was because of what we'd seen, but we both knew. There are other places to hunt deer, places where you don't have to worry about 8-foot-tall creatures watching you from behind trees. I've thought about that day thousands of times since then, questioned my own memory, wondered if we really saw what I think we saw, but then I remember the silence, the complete consuming silence that fell over those woods, the way those trees bent and snapped as the creature passed through them, the raw power in its movements. I've never told this story publicly before. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway, but I know what I saw that day, and sometimes, when I'm in the woods alone and things get quiet, I find myself scanning the trees, looking for that dark figure standing in the shadows. Because once you've seen something like that, you can never unsee it. You can never go back to believing the world is exactly what they tell you it is. You're left knowing there are things out there, unexplained things, just beyond the edge of our understanding. And sometimes, when the conditions are just right, you might come face to face with them. All I can say is, if the woods suddenly go silent around you, look up, look carefully. You might not be as alone as you think. Story 13. I still get the chills when I think about what happened to me 23 years ago. I've only told this story to a handful of people because, well, who would believe me? But I need to get this off my chest once and for all. It was November of 2000, peak deer season in Pennsylvania. I'd been hunting in the woods outside Wellsboro my entire life. The same spots my dad took me to when I was just a kid. Those woods were like a second home to me. I knew every trail, every ridge, every good spot to set up, or at least I thought I did. That morning started like any other hunting day. I woke up at 4:30, had my coffee and some eggs, packed my gear, and headed out while it was still dark. The temperature was in the low 30s, cold enough to see your breath, but not so cold that your fingers would go numb on the trigger. Perfect hunting weather. I parked my old Ford pickup at the end of this logging road about a mile from my favorite spot. I remember checking my watch. It was just after 6 in the morning, and the sky was starting to lighten up. There was this eerie fog hanging low over the ground, not thick enough to cause problems, just enough to make everything feel a bit mysterious. I grabbed my Remington 700, made sure I had extra rounds, my hunting knife, some water, and a couple protein bars. I always packed light for these trips. The less noise you make, the better your chances. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes along the edge of this wooded section that borders an open field. The field was where the deer often came out to graze in the early morning. My plan was to find a good spot at the edge of the tree line where I could watch the field but stay hidden. That's when I noticed something weird. About 50 yards ahead of me, there was this big oak tree shaking like crazy. And I mean shaking, like someone was grabbing it and rocking it back and forth. My first thought was maybe it was a bear scratching itself, but even a big black bear wouldn't make a tree that size move like that. What made it even stranger was that none of the other trees were moving at all. There wasn't even a slight breeze that morning. The fog was just sitting there, dead still. I slowed down, trying to move as quietly as possible. I crouched a bit and raised my rifle, not to shoot, just to use the scope to get a better look. That's when I saw it, and I swear my heart nearly stopped. Behind the tree was this thing. It was tall, ridiculously tall, probably around 8 feet. It was covered in thick black hair from head to toe, not fur like a bear, but hair, more like a human's, but coarser and longer. The color wasn't just black, it had this slight reddish tint to it in some places, especially around what I assumed was its shoulders. I couldn't make out its face clearly. It was partially hidden behind the tree, and there was still some morning mist hanging in the air. But I could see enough to know this wasn't anything I recognized. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else entirely. The way it was moving was the strangest part. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. It was almost playful. It would lean out from behind the tree, just enough for me to see part of its body, then duck back behind it. Then it would peek out from the other side like it was playing some kind of game, like a kid playing peekaboo, except this kid was massive and covered in hair. I stood there, frozen, watching this bizarre scene unfold. My finger wasn't on the trigger. I wasn't even thinking about shooting. I was just mesmerized, confused, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This went on for maybe a minute or two, though it felt like an eternity. I was barely breathing, afraid that any movement or sound would either scare it away or, worse, draw its attention directly to me. Eventually, I decided to keep moving. Not toward it, but along my planned route toward the field. I took a wide berth around that tree, keeping my eyes on the creature the whole time. It didn't follow me. It just stood there, still playing its strange game with the tree, occasionally making these soft grunting sounds that carried through the still morning air. I made it to the edge of the field and found a good spot behind a fallen log. The field was about 100 yards across, with another section of woods on the far side. I settled in, still shaken by what I'd seen, but trying to focus on the hunt. After all, that's what I was there for. About 30 minutes later, a decent-sized buck walked out into the field. 8-pointer, good size, not massive, but respectable. It was about 70 yards away, an easy shot. I raised my rifle, took aim, controlled my breathing and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out across the field, breaking the morning silence. The buck dropped instantly. Clean kill. I should have felt that rush of satisfaction, that hunter's high. But all I felt was a strange uneasiness. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I waited a few minutes, like I always do, to make sure the deer was down for good. Then I stood up, shouldered my rifle, and started walking toward the buck. That's when I heard it. From behind me, back in the direction of that shaking tree, came the sound of something big moving through the woods, not just walking but running, crashing through underbrush, snapping branches. It was moving fast, and it was heading straight toward me. I dove back behind the log, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned, rifle ready, expecting to see a charging bear or maybe an angry buck I hadn't noticed before. What burst from the tree line wasn't either of those things. It was the same tall, black, hair-covered creature I'd seen earlier. It was running on 2 legs, not 4. Its stride was long and powerful, covering ground faster than any human could. Its arms swung at its sides, unnaturally long, with hands that looked too big for even its massive frame. But it wasn't running at me. It was running toward the deer I'd just shot. I pressed myself lower behind the log, praying it hadn't seen me. The creature reached the deer in seconds. It stopped and crouched down beside the fallen buck. I could see it clearly now, though I was still about 50 yards away. It reached out with those long arms and touched the deer almost gently. It seemed to be examining the wound, sniffing at the blood. Then, in one fluid motion, it grabbed the deer, a buck that had to weigh at least 150 pounds, and hoisted it onto its shoulder like it was nothing more than a sack of potatoes. No strain, no effort. Just lifted it up and stood there for a moment, the deer draped across its massive shoulders. That's when it made the sound. Not a growl or a roar, but this strange whooping noise. It started low and rose in pitch, almost like a yodel, but more guttural. It made this sound 3 or 4 times, each whoop echoing across the field. Then, with the deer still on its shoulder, it turned and walked back toward the woods. Not running now, just walking with this strange, rolling gait. Its knees seemed to bend differently than a human's, giving it an odd, fluid motion. It disappeared back into the tree line, those whooping sounds continuing for a few moments before fading away. I stayed hidden behind that log for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. I was shaking so hard I could barely hold my rifle. My mouth was dry, and I kept swallowing, trying to get some moisture back. I've been hunting my whole life. I've come across bears, coyotes, even had a run-in with an angry bull moose once up in Maine. But I've never felt fear like I did that day. It wasn't just that this thing was big and strong. It wasn't just that it had taken my deer. It was the intelligence in its movements, the purposefulness. Whatever I saw that day wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. It knew what it was doing. It waited until I shot the deer, then came to claim it, like it was using me as its hunter. When I finally got the courage to move, I didn't even think about tracking the creature or trying to find my deer. I just wanted out of those woods. I practically ran back to my truck, constantly looking over my shoulder, my rifle ready. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I drove straight home and didn't go hunting again that season. Didn't tell anyone what happened either. Who would believe me? Hey, a Bigfoot stole my deer isn't exactly a story that goes over well at the local bar. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. It was something else. The locals around Wellsboro have stories. Old stories about something living in those woods. Most people laugh them off as campfire tales. I used to laugh too. I've been back to those woods since then. Can't stay away completely. It's been my hunting ground for too long. But I never go alone anymore, and I never stay past dusk, and I've never gone back to that specific spot where it all happened. The weird thing is, even when I'm hunting with buddies in completely different areas, miles from where I saw that thing, I still get this feeling sometimes, this prickling on the back of my neck, this certainty that I'm being watched, that it's out there, watching me from behind some tree, playing its strange peekaboo game. I don't know if it was a Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever you want to call it. I just know it was real, it was intelligent, and it was strong enough to carry a full-grown deer, like it was nothing. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear those whooping sounds echoing through the trees. I've tried to convince myself it was just a weird bear, or maybe I was overtired and imagining things, but deep down, I know better. There's something out there in those Pennsylvania woods, something that's watching us, learning from us, and sometimes, when it gets hungry, it lets us do the hard work and then helps itself to the reward. To this day, whenever I'm in the woods and I notice a tree shaking when there's no wind, I turn around and head home. Some things just aren't worth the risk of encountering twice. Story 14. I'm still trying to process what happened last week. I've barely slept since then. Every time I close my eyes, I see those yellow eyes staring back at me. I need to get this down somewhere before I convince myself it wasn't real. I've been keeping bees for almost 15 years now on our property at the edge of the Huron-Manistee National Forest in northern Michigan. My wife Karen thinks I'm obsessed, and maybe I am. There's something peaceful about tending to the hives, watching the intricate society of the bees, harvesting honey that tastes like the forest itself. We've got about 10 acres, with our house situated near the front of the property, and my apiary set up about 100 yards into the woods, where there's a nice clearing. Last Monday morning started like any other day. I got up at 5:30, made coffee, and headed out to check on my hives before heading to my job at the hardware store in town. I've got a routine. I always visit the hives at dawn and dusk. As I approached the clearing, I immediately knew something was wrong. My stomach dropped when I saw one of my best hives completely destroyed, not just damaged, utterly demolished. The boxes were splintered and scattered across the ground, frames broken apart, and honey everywhere. The destruction was methodical in a way that disturbed me. Bears usually just tear into hives, but this seemed different. Whatever did this had systematically taken the hive apart. I've dealt with bears before. We get them around here sometimes, but this didn't look like typical bear damage. Still, what else could it be? I spent the morning cleaning up and salvaging what I could, but I lost the entire colony. These weren't just some random bees to me. I'd raised that queen myself, watched that colony grow over 3 years. Each hive has its own personality, its own quirks. This one had been particularly gentle, producing the clearest, sweetest honey. After work, I kept thinking about what happened. I decided I wasn't going to lose another hive. I'd stake out the apiary that night and scare off whatever was destroying my bees. Karen thought I was being ridiculous. "Will, just call the DNR if you think it's a bear," she said while I was loading my shotgun at the kitchen table. "You don't need to sit out there all night. If I call them, they'll just set a trap days from now. By then, I might lose all my hives," I replied. "Besides, I just want to scare it off, not hurt it." I packed a thermos of coffee, a couple sandwiches, my flashlight, and grabbed my shotgun. It wasn't anything special, just an old Remington 870 I've had for years. I loaded it with birdshot, enough to make a loud noise and sting, but not cause serious damage to a bear. The plan was simple: wait in a tree near the hives, and if anything approached, fire a warning shot to scare it away. Around 8 o'clock, just as dusk was settling in, I climbed up into an old oak tree about 30 feet from my remaining 9 hives. I'd set up a simple platform there years ago for bow hunting, though I rarely used it anymore. It gave me a perfect view of the entire clearing. The forest at night is never completely quiet, but something felt off from the start. Usually, You hear all sorts of creatures, owls calling, small animals rustling through underbrush, the occasional distant coyote. But that night, everything seemed muted, like the forest was holding its breath. Hours passed. I checked my watch. 11:30. Nothing had happened and I was starting to feel foolish. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s and I was getting stiff sitting in that tree. I took a sip of coffee from my thermos, now barely lukewarm, and considered packing it in. That's when I noticed the silence. Complete, absolute silence. No insects chirping, no leaves rustling, nothing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. I strained my ears and detected what sounded like heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the east side of the clearing, opposite from the direction of our house. Slow, methodical steps that seemed to pause every few seconds. Whatever it was big. The footsteps weren't the quick patter of a deer or the clumsy crashing of a bear. These were calculated, almost cautious. I gripped my shotgun tighter, adrenaline suddenly flooding my system. My mouth went dry. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing, just beyond where my flashlight could reach. I could sense something watching, assessing the situation. I remained absolutely still, barely breathing. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, the footsteps resumed, moving directly toward my hives. I still couldn't see anything in the darkness. My hands were shaking as I raised my flashlight. I hesitated before turning it on, suddenly unsure if I wanted to see what was out there. Taking a deep breath, I flicked the switch. What I saw next is something I'll never forget for as long as I live. Standing over my hives was the largest creature I've ever seen. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand 10 feet tall on two legs. Bears don't have shoulders as wide as my pickup truck. Bears don't have arms that hang down to their knees, and bears definitely don't have eyes that glow yellow when caught in a flashlight beam. The creature was covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was God. I still have trouble describing it. It was almost human-like but distorted, with a pronounced brow and a wide, flat nose. But those eyes, they reflected my light like a deer's would. But they were intelligent, aware, and they were looking directly at me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I was frozen in place, unable to move or even think clearly. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if curious. It didn't seem startled by my presence or the light. Instead, it slowly reached toward one of my hives with hands that ended in thick, dark claws. That's what snapped me out of my trance. It was going to destroy another one of my hives. Without thinking, I raised my shotgun and fired. The sound was deafening in the silent forest. I pumped and fired again, more out of panic than anything else. The creature let out a sound I'll never forget. Not a roar or a growl, but a deep, resonant bellow that seemed to come from deep within its massive chest. It was a sound of pain and rage that echoed through the trees and seemed to vibrate in my own chest. I expected it to charge at me. Instead, it turned with surprising speed and grace for something so large and disappeared into the forest. The ground actually trembled slightly with each of its massive strides. Within seconds, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I sat there in shock, my ears ringing from the gunshots, trying to process what I'd just seen. My entire body was shaking. I couldn't move. I just sat there, clutching my shotgun, scanning the darkness frantically in case it came back. A few minutes later, I heard shouting. It was Karen running from our house with a flashlight, calling my name. The shotgun blasts had woken her. I wanted to call out to her, to tell her to go back to the house, but I was afraid the creature might still be nearby. Finally, I managed to yell back, "I'm up in the tree! Stay where you are!" She stopped at the edge of the clearing. "Will, what happened? Are you okay?" Before I could answer, I saw the beams of more flashlights bobbing through the trees from the direction of our driveway. Someone must have heard the shots and called the police. 2 officers from the county sheriff's department emerged into the clearing. I climbed down from the tree on shaky legs. Karen ran to me, checking me over for injuries. The officers approached cautiously, their hands near their holstered weapons. "Sir, we received reports of gunshots. Was that you?" one of them asked. I nodded, still dazed. I was protecting my beehives. There was something here. "A bear?" the officer asked. I hesitated. What could I tell them? That I'd seen a 10-foot-tall creature with glowing eyes, that I'd shot at something that looked like it walked straight out of a cryptozoology book. "I don't know what it was," I finally said. "It was huge, much bigger than any bear I've ever seen." The officers exchanged a glance. I could see the skepticism in their eyes. "Did you hit it?" the second officer asked. "I think so. It made a sound like it was hurt." They insisted on searching the area. We found large, strange depressions in the soil near the hives that could have been footprints, but they were distorted and unclear. There was no blood trail, no fur, nothing concrete to prove what had been there. "Probably a black bear," the first officer concluded. "They can look bigger than they are when they stand up, and their eyes can reflect light in strange ways." I didn't argue. What was the point? I knew what I'd seen, and it wasn't a bear. But I also knew how it would sound if I tried to explain. They gave me a warning about discharging firearms at night and left. Karen tried to get me to come back to the house, but I refused. I stayed out there until dawn, watching over my hives. Nothing returned. The next day, I went into the forest, trying to find any evidence of the creature or where it had gone. I searched for hours, but found nothing conclusive. No blood trail, no massive footprints, nothing. It was as if it had never existed. It's been a week now. I've reinforced my hives and set up motion-activated floodlights around the clearing. I've taken to sleeping during the day and watching over the apiary at night. Karen thinks I'm losing my mind. Maybe I am. But I know what I saw. I've lived in these woods my entire life. I know what bears look like. I know what every animal in these forests looks like. What I saw that night wasn't any known animal. The strangest thing? The hives that weren't destroyed have been producing honey at an incredible rate since that night. The honey is darker, richer than usual. And sometimes, when I'm tending to the bees, I get the distinct feeling that I'm being watched from the tree line. I don't know what's out there in the Michigan forests. I don't know why it wanted my honey or what connection it has to my bees. But I know it's real, and I know it's still out there. And every night, as darkness falls, I wonder if those yellow eyes are watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. Story 15. I've been debating whether to share this for years now. I'm 27. And what happened when I was 16 still gives me nightmares. I've only told this story to a few people because most think I'm making it up. But I swear on everything I care about that this happened exactly as I'm about to describe it. It was August 4th, 2012. Me, Dylan, and my two best friends, Ryan and Marcus, had finally convinced our parents to let us go camping alone in Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky. We'd been begging for this trip since freshman year, and they finally caved the summer before junior year. We were pumped, our first real adventure without adults hovering over us. We packed Ryan's older brother's Jeep with 2 tents, sleeping bags, enough snacks to feed a small army, and way too many energy drinks. The drive took about 3 hours, and we spent the whole time talking about how we'd stay up all night. Maybe try the beers Marcus had snuck from his dad's garage fridge, and just be idiots in the woods like teenagers are supposed to be. We arrived around 4 in the afternoon and decided to hike a bit before setting up camp. We wanted somewhere secluded, where we wouldn't run into park rangers who might ask questions about us being there alone. After about an hour of hiking, we found this perfect little clearing about half a mile off one of the less used trails. It had an old fire ring already there, stones arranged in a circle with charred wood inside. So we figured other people had camped there before. The spot was perfect. Trees surrounded us on all sides, creating this natural privacy barrier. There was a small creek about 50 yards away where we could get water. We set up my tent, big enough for two, where Ryan and I would sleep, and Marcus set up his one-person tent about 15 feet away. The evening was awesome. We got a decent fire going after some embarrassing attempts. None of us were exactly Eagle Scouts. Cooked hot dogs on sticks, and yes, we each had a beer. Just one, though. We were trying to be at least somewhat responsible. We told ghost stories, talked about girls from school, and just enjoyed being away from our parents and the pressure of everyday life. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. The night had gotten chilly, and we were actually pretty tired from the hike and excitement. Ryan and I crawled into our tent, and Marcus went to his. I remember joking that if bears came, they'd eat Marcus first, since he was alone. I fell asleep almost immediately. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up, but it was still pitch black outside. At first, I couldn't figure out what had woken me. Then it hit me. The silence. Complete, absolute silence. If you've ever spent time in the woods at night, you know it's never actually quiet. There's always a background noise of insects buzzing, frogs croaking, leaves rustling, but there was nothing, not a single sound. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the entire forest. I lay there for maybe 2 minutes, feeling increasingly uneasy. Ryan was still asleep beside me, breathing heavily. I was about to wake him up when I heard it. Footsteps, heavy footsteps, moving slowly toward our campsite from the direction of the creek. These weren't human footsteps. They were too heavy, too deliberate. Each one made a distinct thud that I could feel in my chest. Whatever was walking toward us was big, really big. The footsteps stopped right outside our campsite. I was lying completely still, barely breathing, when suddenly, whack, something hit the side of our tent with incredible force. Not like a branch falling, like something had deliberately slapped the tent wall. Ryan jerked awake. "What the f—" he started to say, but I clamped my hand over his mouth. I could feel him trembling as we both sat frozen, listening. The footsteps moved around our tent slowly, methodically, then they moved away toward Marcus's tent. A few seconds later, we heard the same whack against his tent, followed by Marcus's muffled, "Holy shit!" Whatever was out there was moving between our tents, making its presence known. It wasn't a curious animal checking us out. It felt deliberate, threatening. Then came the worst part. As the creature moved back to our tent, I heard a splashing sound against the fabric. At first, I thought it was starting to rain, but the smell hit me immediately. Strong, musky, ammonia-like. The thing was pissing on our tent, actually urinating all over it, soaking through the fabric. Ryan and I pressed ourselves against the opposite side, but some of the liquid still got on our sleeping bags. The smell was overwhelming. Nothing like any animal I'd ever encountered. It was primal, territorial. After it finished marking our tent, the creature let out this deep grunt. Not a growl, not a roar. A grunt that came from so deep in its chest that I felt it more than heard it. It vibrated through me, and I swear I've never been more terrified in my life. Then it moved away from our tent, back toward the tree line behind our campsite. For a moment, I thought it was leaving. But then we heard the most bone-chilling sound, the unmistakable crack of a tree breaking, not a branch snapping underfoot, but the sound of a substantial tree being forcefully broken. The crack echoed through the forest, followed by a heavy thud as part of the tree hit the ground. Ryan whispered, "What the fuck is happening?" His voice was shaking so badly, I could barely understand him. Before I could answer, we heard Marcus's tent unzip. A second later, he was frantically scratching at our tent door. Let me in, he hissed. I unzipped our tent and Marcus practically dove inside. He was shaking uncontrollably, his face pale even in the darkness. "Did you see it?" he gasped. "No," I whispered, "but it pissed all over our tent." "Mine too," Marcus said. "We need to get out of here. Now." We debated what to do for maybe 30 seconds, but when we heard more movement in the trees, we made our decision. We were going to grab only what we absolutely needed and run. As we prepared to leave, I peered out of the tent flap. That's when I saw it, or at least part of it. A massive figure moving between the trees about 30 yards from our campsite. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and covered in dark hair. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand and move like that. This thing was walking upright, swinging its long arms as it moved deeper into the forest. I ducked back inside the tent. "Go." "Now," I whispered. We grabbed our phones, car keys, and nothing else. Everything else, the tents, sleeping bags, food, clothes, we left behind. We didn't even put on our shoes. In our socks and pajamas, we bolted from the campsite, running down the trail in the dark. I've never run so fast in my life. We stumbled over roots and rocks, scraping our feet and legs, but we didn't stop. The only light we had was from Ryan's phone flashlight, which bounced wildly as we ran. We kept expecting to hear those heavy footsteps coming after us, but they never did. It took us about 20 terrifying minutes to reach the Jeep. We piled in, locked the doors, and sat there panting and shaking. Our clothes and skin reeked of that musky urine. The smell was so strong that Ryan actually threw up out the car door. We didn't even discuss what to do next. Ryan started the Jeep, and we tore out of that parking area like we were being chased. It was around 3 in the morning, and we drove the entire 3 hours home without stopping once. When we got back to Ryan's house, it was just after 6 in the morning. His parents were furious that we'd come back early without calling, but they took one whiff of us, and their anger turned to confusion. We told them we'd had a run-in with some animal that sprayed us, maybe a skunk or something, and that we got scared and decided to come home. I don't think they believed us, but they didn't press it. We showered and burned those clothes. Even after washing 3 times, I could still smell that musky odor on my skin. Over the next few days, we researched what might have happened. We looked at bears, moose, elk, anything that could explain what we experienced. Nothing fit until Marcus found some websites about Sasquatch encounters. The territorial marking, the tree breaking, the silence in the forest, it all matched descriptions from other people's experiences. I know how this sounds. Believe me, I know. If someone told me this story, I'd think they were full of shit or had gotten into some bad mushrooms in the woods. But I know what I experienced. I know what I saw moving through those trees. And I know that none of us has ever gone back to Daniel Boone National Forest since that night. It's been 11 years, and I still have nightmares about that grunt, that smell, and that massive silhouette moving between the trees. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, thinking I hear heavy footsteps outside my window. The rational part of my brain says it was probably just a territorial bear or some other explanation. But deep down, I know it wasn't. Whatever visited our campsite that night wasn't something science has properly classified. I still go camping occasionally, but never without a large group, never without being well armed, and never, ever in that part of Kentucky. Some places aren't meant for humans to intrude upon, and some creatures don't want to be discovered. That night, I think we stumbled into something's territory, and it made damn sure we knew we weren't welcome. Story 16. I haven't been able to sleep right since that night last August. I keep running it over in my head, trying to make sense of what happened, but I can't. I live on about 20 acres outside of Millbrook, property that's been in my family for generations. It's mostly just me and my 2 German shepherds, Axel and Sadie. I've always felt safe out here, even being so isolated until now. It was around 9:30 at night on August 15th, 2023. The temperature had finally dropped below 80 degrees, and I figured it was a good time to let the dogs have their evening bathroom break. We'd been dealing with an uptick in coyote activity that summer. My neighbor Frank lost 3 chickens the week before, and I'd been hearing them howling closer to the house than usual. That's why I started carrying my high-powered spotlight when taking the dogs out after dark. It's one of those rechargeable ones that can light up half a football field. Axel and Sadie are big dogs, but coyotes can get bold when they're in packs, and I didn't want to take any chances. The night was quiet, except for the usual cricket chorus and occasional rustling in the tall grass from field mice. My property backs up to about 300 feet of open yard that transitions into a soybean field. Beyond that is a grassy clearing, maybe 50 feet wide, and then the woods start, thick, old-growth forest that stretches for miles. I was standing on my back deck while the dogs sniffed around the yard. It was routine, something I'd done thousands of times before. I swept my spotlight across the field, more out of habit than actual concern. The beam caught the tree line, illuminating the edges of the soybeans, the clearing, and the first row of trees. That's when I saw them. Two sets of eyes reflecting my light back at me. At first, I thought they might be deer. We get them all the time, and their eyes reflect light like little green lanterns. But something wasn't right. These eyes weren't low to the ground like a deer's would be. They were high, way too high. I'd guess at least 7 feet off the ground, maybe higher. The hair on my arms stood up immediately. The reflections were perfectly round, almost like glass. Not blinking, not moving, just watching. I steadied the beam, focusing it directly on those eyes. And that's when they ducked behind a large bush at the edge of the field. It wasn't a casual movement, like a deer startled by light. It was deliberate. Like whatever owned those eyes knew, I could see them and wanted to hide. My heart was pounding now. I called the dogs closer to me, but kept the light trained on that bush. After about 20 seconds, one set of eyes peeked out from the left side of the bush. They stared directly at me. Then, a few seconds later, the second set appeared from the right side of the same bush. I'm not easily spooked. I've lived in rural areas my entire life. I've encountered bears, coyotes, even a mountain lion once. But this was different. There was an awareness in those eyes, an intelligence. I decided to test something. I turned off my spotlight for maybe 5 seconds, then flicked it back on. Both sets of eyes were fully visible again, staring at me from the edge of the field. When I centered my beam on them, they disappeared behind the bush again. It felt like some bizarre game of hide and seek. I'd move my light away, count to 5, then swing it back, and there they'd be. But the moment I focused directly on them, they'd retreat. This went on for several minutes. My dog sensed something was wrong. Axel started growling, his hackles raised. Sadie pressed against my leg, which she only does when she's nervous. Whatever was watching us wasn't natural to these woods, not at that height. Not with that behavior. The closest thing I could compare it to was when you catch kids sneaking around. That playful hiding when spotted, but continuing to peek out because they're curious. Except these weren't kids. Nothing human could have eyes that reflected like that. And nothing around here stands that tall, unless it's on 2 legs. After about 5 minutes of this bizarre interaction, I decided I'd had enough. I called the dogs, and we went inside. I locked the door behind us, something I rarely do out here. Through the kitchen window I could see my spotlight beam, still pointed at the tree line, but from inside, I couldn't tell if those eyes were still there. I paced around my living room for maybe 10 minutes, trying to convince myself it was just some weird trick of the light. Maybe it was owls. We have great horned owls out here, but owls don't play peekaboo, and they certainly don't stand 7 feet tall. I couldn't let it go. I had to know what was out there. I grabbed my spotlight and my phone, left the dogs inside. They were still agitated, and I figured if something went wrong, at least they'd be safe. I stepped back onto my deck and swept the light across the field again. Nothing. No eyes. No movement. I made a decision that looking back was probably stupid. I started walking toward the spot where I'd seen those eyes. The beam of my spotlight carved a path through the darkness as I crossed my yard and entered the soybean field. The plants brushed against my jeans, still wet with evening dew. The closer I got to the tree line, the more my courage wavered. Every rustle in the soybeans made me jump. Every shadow seemed to shift and move. By the time I reached the edge of the field, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the spotlight steady. I stood at the border between the soybeans and the grassy clearing. Ahead of me was the exact bush where I'd seen those eyes. It was a large thicket, maybe 8 feet tall, some kind of wild blackberry bush that had grown unchecked for years. I aimed my light at it, half expecting those eyes to appear again. Nothing happened. I took a few more steps forward, entering the clearing. The grass here was almost waist high, making it difficult to see if anything was hiding low to the ground. That's when I heard it. A sound I've never heard before and hope to never hear again. It wasn't a growl or a hoot or any normal animal sound. It was a low, rumbling breath, like someone trying to breathe quietly but unable to fully suppress the sound due to their size. It came from somewhere to my left, deeper in the clearing. I swung my light in that direction but saw nothing. The grass was moving, though, swaying in a pattern that couldn't be explained by wind. Something was moving through it, circling around behind me. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I started backing up toward my house, keeping the light trained on that moving grass. Whatever it was big enough to push through the tall grass without fully emerging above it. I kept backing up until I reached the soybean field again. That's when I heard another sound, this time from my right. A similar breathing sound, but slightly different in pitch. There were 2 of them. I broke into a run. I crashed through the soybeans, not caring about the plants whipping against my face and arms. I didn't look back until I reached my yard. When I did turn around, my spotlight caught them again. Those same 2 sets of eyes, now at the edge of the soybean field where I had just been. They were even higher off the ground than before, as if whatever owned them had stood up to its full height. I've never run so fast in my life. I made it to my house, slammed the door behind me, and locked it. My dogs were going crazy, barking and scratching at the door, sensing my fear and the presence of whatever was out there. I went to every window and pulled the curtains closed. I checked every lock twice. Then I sat on my couch with my shotgun across my lap until sunrise. I didn't sleep. How could I? Every creak, every sound outside had me on edge. Around 3 in the morning, both dogs suddenly went to the kitchen window and started growling. I couldn't bring myself to look. When dawn finally came, I waited until the sun was fully up before venturing outside. The dogs stayed close to me as I walked back to where I'd seen those eyes the night before. The morning light revealed nothing unusual. No footprints I could find, no broken branches, nothing to indicate what had been watching me, but something had changed. The air felt different, like my property wasn't fully mine anymore. It's been almost 3 months now, and I haven't seen those eyes again, but I know they're out there. Sometimes at night, I'll hear that same deep, rumbling breath outside my bedroom window. The dogs still get agitated around dusk, staring out toward the soybean field with their ears perked. I've researched local wildlife extensively. Nothing matches what I saw. I've considered black bears standing on hind legs, but they don't move like what I saw moving through that grass. Bears don't play hide and seek with spotlights. They don't circle around to trap you. I installed security cameras last month. So far they haven't captured anything unusual, but the batteries drain faster than they should, especially the one pointing toward the tree line. I don't take the dogs out after dark anymore. We go out before sunset and stay close to the house. I've told a few friends about what happened, but I can see the disbelief in their eyes. They think I'm paranoid or that I imagined it, but I know what I saw. Those eyes were real. They were watching me, studying me, playing with me. Whatever was at the edge of my property that night wasn't any animal native to these woods. It was something else, something that knew exactly what it was doing, something intelligent enough to hide when spotted, but curious enough to keep watching. And I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for another chance to play its game. Story 17. I still can't believe what happened last Sunday. I've gone over it in my head 1,000 times, trying to make sense of what we all saw. None of us expected our usual weekend walk to turn into whatever that was. I'm writing this down because I need to get it out, and maybe someone here has seen something similar, or can help explain what we encountered. It was January 7th, 1894. The winter had been harsh. but that day brought clearer skies than we'd seen in weeks. I remember thinking it was a good sign, a chance to get out of the house after being cooped up through the holidays. A few of us from town had planned to meet at the crossroads near Mine Hill for a Sunday afternoon stroll. Nothing unusual about that. Our group was larger than normal. There was me, Bertha Heatig, along with my friends Lizzie Guscott and Katie Griffin. The Dean brothers, Mike and Bill, were there too, as was William Mullins and a couple others from town. Several people had brought their dogs, thinking they could use a good run after being housebound during the snow. We'd been walking for maybe an hour, following the old logging path that winds around the base of Mine Hill. The area used to be heavily worked for iron ore, but many of the smaller mines had been abandoned years ago. Still, it's a place we all know well. I've walked those paths since I was a child. It was around 2 in the afternoon when everything changed. We were near the eastern slope, where the forest gets thicker. Mike Dean's dog suddenly stopped, hair bristling along its spine. Before anyone could react, all the dogs began barking frantically, straining at their leads and pointing toward a dense thicket of pines about 50 yards ahead. "What's got into them?" Lizzie asked, struggling to hold her terrier back. We all stopped, peering toward where the dogs were focused. At first, I saw nothing but shadows and trees. Then something moved. It wasn't like a deer or a bear, both common enough in our woods. This movement was deliberate, upright. "There's someone there," William Mullins said, stepping forward. "Hello, you there in the trees?" No response came, but the shape shifted again. I'll never forget what happened next. The figure emerged partially from the shadows, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't fully visible, but what I could see made no sense. It was tall, nearly 6 feet, and covered in dark, matted hair. Not fur like an animal, but hair like a man's. Only it covered everything we could see. Its face was partially obscured, but I caught glimpses of a wild, tangled beard and piercing eyes watching us from beneath a heavy brow. "Dear God," Katie whispered beside me, her hand squeezing my arm so tight it hurt. The Dean brothers immediately stepped forward. Bill called out again, demanding to know who was there. The figure remained half hidden, watching us with an unnerving stillness. Then Mike's dog broke free, charging toward the strange being with teeth bared. What happened next still chills me. The creature, I don't know what else to call it, swung out from behind the tree with surprising speed. That's when I saw it was carrying something in its hand. A crude club, looked like a thick branch stripped of smaller limbs. As the dog leaped, the being swung with terrible force, connecting with a sickening thud that sent the poor animal flying sideways with a pained yelp. "It's got a weapon," someone shouted. The creature stood fully revealed now, and I could see it clearly for the first time. It was undeniably man-shaped, but covered in thick, dark hair from head to foot. Not like a costume. This wasn't some prank. The hair moved naturally with its body. Its face was the most disturbing part, human-like but wild, with a matted beard that blended into the hair covering its chest. It wore no clothing that I could discern, though the thick hair obscured most details. It looked weathered, middle-aged perhaps, though it's hard to tell with something so strange. Its eyes reflected intelligence, fear, and anger all at once. Mike Dean rushed to his injured dog, while his brother Bill, always the hothead, grabbed a fallen branch and stepped toward the creature. William Mullins joined him, and before I knew it, several of the men were advancing, yelling and waving their arms. I think they meant to capture it, though what they would have done if they had, I can't imagine. The wild man, that's the only way I can describe it, gripped its club with both hands and let out a sound I'll never forget. Not quite a shout, not quite a growl, but something primitive that raised every hair on my body. Then it charged, swinging its club in wide arcs that kept the men at bay. "Circle around," Bill Dean shouted. "Don't let it get away." The men tried to spread out, but the creature was surprisingly agile. It darted between two of them, then turned to face the group again, backing slowly toward the denser part of the forest. William Mullins managed to get close enough to lunge for it, but the wild man swung its club again, missing William's head by inches. Lizzie pulled at my sleeve. "Bertha, we should go back to town for help." But none of us could move. It was like watching something impossible unfold, something that shouldn't exist in our orderly world. The creature continued backing away, keeping the club between itself and our group. Bill Dean, always reckless, suddenly rushed forward. The creature met his charge with a powerful swing that caught Bill across the shoulder and sent him sprawling to the ground. He wasn't badly hurt, more stunned than anything, but the wild man used that moment to turn and sprint into the trees with surprising speed. "After it!" Mike Dean shouted, helping his brother to his feet. The men gave chase, crashing through the underbrush. Us women stayed behind with the dogs, too shocked to follow. Mike's dog was whimpering, struggling to stand. The blow from the club had caught it across the ribs, and I feared they might be broken. Katie knelt beside it, trying to offer comfort. "What was that thing?" Lizzie whispered, her face pale. It couldn't be human." "I don't know," I said honestly, "but it moved like a man, thought like a man too. Did you see how it used that club?" We waited for nearly 20 minutes before the men returned, sweating and out of breath despite the January chill. They had lost the creature in the deeper forest. "It knows these woods," William Mullins said, his usual confidence shaken. "Disappeared like a ghost once it got past the old mine entrance." Mike Dean was cradling his injured dog. Whatever it was, it nearly killed Rusty. Hit him so hard I thought he was done for. Bill Dean's face was flushed with excitement and anger. "We need to organize a proper search. Get more men, guns, better dogs. That thing isn't natural." The walk back to town was tense and hurried. None of us wanted to be in those woods as the early winter dusk approached. By the time we reached Dover, word of our encounter was spreading like wildfire. Some laughed it off as a trapper gone wild or an escaped lunatic. Others crossed themselves and spoke of devils in the forest. The next morning, a search party formed, nearly 20 men with rifles and hunting dogs. Bill Dean appointed himself leader, his shoulder bruised, but his pride demanding vengeance. They combed the woods around Mine Hill all day, focusing on the abandoned mine entrances and caves that dotted the area. They found strange footprints in several places, larger than a man's but undeniably human in shape, and signs of crude camps, but no wild man. They searched again the next day, and the next, but the creature had vanished. Some claimed to have heard strange cries in the night, too deep and resonant to be any animal they knew, but no one caught sight of our hairy wild man again. It's been nearly a week now. The searches have stopped, though some men still carry rifles when they need to venture near Mine Hill. Mike's dog survived but limps badly. The vet said 2 ribs were cracked by the blow. When I close my eyes at night, I still see those piercing, intelligent eyes watching us from beneath that heavy brow. I don't know what we saw that day. Some in town have already begun to dismiss it as mass hysteria or an exaggerated encounter with a hermit. But 7 of us saw it clearly, and we all described the same thing, a wild, hairy, man-like creature that defended itself with a weapon and thought like a human. The most disturbing part wasn't its appearance, though that was shocking enough. It was the intelligence in its eyes. This wasn't some mindless beast. It was thinking, planning, watching us with what seemed like recognition. Like it knew what we were and understood the threat we posed. It used a tool. It employed strategy. These aren't the actions of an animal. I find myself wondering where it came from. Has it always lived in our woods, staying hidden all these years? Is it alone? Or are there others? And most troubling, what does it do when we aren't there to see it? The forest around Mine Hill feels different now. I used to find comfort in those familiar paths and trees. Now I find myself watching the shadows, listening for unusual sounds, and wondering what else might be out there, just beyond our understanding. I'm not sure I'll ever walk those woods again without remembering the wild man and those knowing eyes that seemed to see right through me. Story 18. I've never told many people about this. My wife knows, and maybe 3 close friends. Most people would just think I'm making it up or that my 9-year-old brain was playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw that day in the winter of '78, and it still gives me chills thinking about it now, over 40 years later. I grew up in a tiny community in northwestern Pennsylvania, one of those places where everybody knows everybody and kids played outside until the streetlights came on. Our neighborhood was surrounded by woods and fields, and in winter we lived for sledding. If we were lucky, we'd get what we called a sledding winter, where the snow stuck around for weeks instead of melting after a few days. That particular winter was one of the best. We'd gotten steady snow since Christmas, and by mid-January we had perfect sledding conditions. The spot all the neighborhood kids went to was this hill behind the Methodist church. It wasn't super steep, but it was long and wide, and it sloped down toward a wooded area that seemed mysterious and endless to us kids. I remember that Saturday so clearly. I woke up to that special kind of silence that only happens when there's been a heavy snowfall overnight. My bedroom window was frosted over, but I could see the brightness outside. We'd gotten at least 6 inches of fresh powder. After wolfing down some Cheerios, I bundled up in my snowsuit, grabbed my wooden toboggan with the red metal runners, and headed out. Mom yelled the usual stuff about being careful and coming home if I got too cold, but I was already halfway down the street. By the time I reached the church, there were already 7 or 8 other kids there. Tommy Sullivan from down the block, the Miller twins, Sarah Peterson, and a few others. We spent the morning racing down the hill, building jumps and having snowball fights. The cold made my cheeks burn, but I didn't care. Those were the days before video games took over. We'd stay outside for hours. Around noon, most kids went home for lunch. I wasn't hungry yet, so I stayed behind. I remember sitting at the top of the hill on my sled, just catching my breath and looking out over the scene. It was one of those bright winter days where the sun reflects off the snow so brightly it hurts your eyes. Long shadows stretched from the trees at the bottom of the hill, and the air had that crisp smell, snow and pine and wood smoke from someone's chimney. I was just sitting there, kind of zoning out, when something caught my eye near the tree line. At first, I thought it was just a shadow moving as clouds passed over the sun. But the sky was clear blue that day, about 40 or 50 feet past where our sleds usually stopped, right at the edge of the woods. Something moved. It stepped out from behind a big pine tree, one of those tall ones with branches that drooped under the weight of the snow. But unlike the snow-covered branches that reflected sunlight, this thing, it seemed to absorb light. It was dark, really dark, against all that white. My first thought was that it was someone from town, maybe a hunter. But it wasn't wearing the bright orange vests hunters always wore, and it moved wrong, too smooth, too deliberate for a person trudging through snow. I sat completely still, my mittened hands gripping the sides of my sled. The thing, and I knew even then it wasn't a person, walked parallel to the bottom of the hill. It wasn't coming toward me, but it wasn't going deeper into the woods either. Just walking along the tree line. The creature was covered in thick hair, brownish black, like a bear, but not shaped like a bear at all. It walked upright, perfectly balanced despite the uneven ground and snow. I remember thinking how weird it was that it didn't seem bothered by the cold. No coat, no clothes at all, just hair. I don't know how long I sat there watching it. Time seemed to stop. But then it turned its head in my direction, and my stomach dropped. It knew I was there. It was aware of me. I could make out its face a little, darker than the hair around it, with deep-set eyes. Not like a person's face, but not like any animal I'd seen either. Something in between. It was huge, 7, maybe 8 feet tall. Its arms hung low, almost to its knees, and it had this stride that covered more ground than seemed possible with each step. There was power in the way it moved, like it could snap a tree trunk if it wanted to. I was terrified, but couldn't look away. It's hard to explain, but I didn't feel threatened exactly. It was more like being witnessed, like when you realize you're being watched by a deer in the woods, and for a moment you're both just acknowledging each other's existence. After what felt like forever, but was probably less than a minute, it disappeared behind another tree. I kept staring at that spot, waiting for it to reappear, but it never did. When I finally worked up the courage to move, I slid down the hill on my sled. I stopped well short of the woods, heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to go look for tracks to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined it. The other part, the smarter part, was screaming to go home. Curiosity won out, at least partially. I left my sled and walked toward where I'd seen the creature, stopping about 20 feet from the tree line. I scanned the ground for footprints, but there weren't any I could see from that distance. The snow was disturbed in places, but it could have been from anything. Deer, fallen snow from branches, the wind. I wasn't brave enough to go into the woods to look closer. Something kept me from crossing that invisible boundary between the open sledding hill and the darkness between the trees. It felt like crossing that line would be accepting an invitation I wasn't ready for. When I heard voices behind me, Tommy and a few others returning from lunch, I almost jumped out of my skin. I turned around, half expecting to see their faces frozen in terror, staring at something behind me. But they were just trudging up the hill with their sleds, laughing about something. "Danny, you've been here the whole time," Tommy called out. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak normally. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost," Sarah said when they got closer. "I'm fine," I managed. "Just cold." I almost told them right then. The words were on the tip of my tongue, but something stopped me. I was a quiet kid anyway, not shy exactly, but I kept things to myself. And this felt private somehow. Plus, I didn't have the words to describe what I'd seen without it sounding made up. So I grabbed my sled and joined them for more runs down the hill. But I couldn't stop looking over at that spot in the woods. Every time we reached the bottom of the hill, I'd scan the tree line, half expecting, half dreading to see that dark figure again. It never reappeared that day. After about an hour, I told everyone I was too cold and headed home. The truth was, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The fun had drained out of the day. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my mind. I tried to convince myself it had been a hunter in dark clothes, or maybe a bear standing on its hind legs, though I knew bears hibernated in winter. None of the explanations fit. The next morning, I went back alone, early before anyone else would be there. I walked straight to the bottom of the hill and, gathering all my courage, went to the spot where I'd seen the creature emerge. The snow around the trees was disturbed, but there were no clear footprints, just depressions and scuffs that could have been anything. I noticed broken branches higher up on some trees, way higher than a person could reach. And there was a strange smell lingering in the air, musky and wild, like wet dog but stronger. I didn't tell my parents. My dad would have dismissed it, or worse, would have grabbed his rifle and gone looking in the woods. My mum would have just worried and probably banned me from sledding there. So I kept it to myself. Over the next few weeks, I returned to the sledding hill with the other kids, but I was always on edge, always watching the tree line. I never saw the creature again that winter, or any winter after. As I got older, I read everything I could find about Bigfoot sightings. This was before the internet, so information wasn't easy to come by. I'd check out books from the library, read newspaper clippings about strange sightings. A lot of what I read matched what I saw. The height, the gait, the way it blended into the forest despite its size. Sometimes I wonder if it was just passing through our area, or if it lived in those woods all along. If it was watching us kids sled day after day, observing our games and laughter from the shadows. The thought still gives me goosebumps. I've been back to my hometown a few times as an adult. The church is still there, and kids still sled on that hill in winter. The woods seem smaller now, less mysterious. Development has eaten away at the forest over the years. I wonder if there's still enough wilderness left for something like that to hide. I'm 49 now, and I still don't know exactly what I saw that day, but I know I saw something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that challenges everything we think we know about what lives in our forests. I've thought about reporting it to one of those Bigfoot research groups, but what's the point after all these years? No evidence, just the memories of a 9-year-old boy that have had 4 decades to shift and change. But some details remain crystal clear. The contrast of that dark figure against the snow, the deliberate way it moved, the moment it turned and looked at me. Those things are burned into my memory. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it if someone told me the same story, but I know what I saw on that winter day in '78, and no amount of rational explanation has ever erased it from my mind.